Vernon Dale stood in the dusty street of Dry Creek, one hand gripping his pregnant daughter's arm, the other extended palm up toward the silent stranger on the black horse. $500 silver, Vernon announced loud enough for the whole town to hear. And you take her off my hands, her and whatever shame she's carrying. I won't have a bastard child bearing my name. The mountain man called Jonah Creed counted out the coins without a word, his scarred face unreadable as stone. Lila Dale, fat, frightened, and about to be sold like livestock, realized in that terrible moment that her father hated her more than he'd ever loved anything in his proud poison life. If you're watching this story unfold, I invite you to stay with me until the very end. Because what begins as the cruelest punishment becomes something neither Lila nor Jonah could have imagined. Please drop a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you to Dry Creek, Montana Territory, in the winter of 1884, where a father's shame became a daughter's unexpected salvation. The morning Vernon Dale decided to sell his daughter, the sky over Dry Creek hung low and gray as a dirty wool blanket. Lila had known something terrible was coming. Her father's silence at breakfast had been the kind that preceded violence, the kind that made the air in their small ranch house feel thin and dangerous. But she hadn't expected this. Not this. She stood now in front of Schneider's General Store, the busiest corner in Dry Creek, where every eye in town could witness her humiliation. Her father's hand was an iron shackle on her upper arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh hard enough to leave bruises that would purple by nightfall. Lila kept her gaze on the weathered boards beneath her feet, on the gap between two planks where she could see a sliver of the mud below, because looking up meant seeing the faces, the women with their mouths pressed into thin lines of righteousness, the men with their eyes sliding away in embarrassment or lingering with something uglier. $500 silver, Vernon repeated, his voice carrying across the street like a preacher's sermon. That's my final offer, Creed. More than she's worth, truth be told, but I'm a fair man. Lila's hands instinctively moved to cover her swollen belly, though the thin fabric of her dress did nothing to hide the evidence of her condition. 6 months along, maybe 7? She'd lost track of time after Billy Henderson had promised her marriage and then disappeared the night she'd told him about the baby. Her father had called her a whore, a disgrace, a stain on the Dale name. He'd made her sleep in the barn for 2 weeks until the winter cold had driven her back inside, though he'd barely spoken to her since except to assign her the hardest chores on the ranch. The man on the black horse, Jonah Creed, sat perfectly still, one gloved hand resting on his saddle horn. Lila had never seen him before, but she'd heard the stories. Everyone in Dry Creek had heard the stories. He lived somewhere up in the high mountains, in a cabin so remote that snow sometimes cut him off from the valley for months at a time. They said he ran with wolves. They said his wife had died screaming and that he'd buried her himself in frozen ground. They said he was touched in the head, that isolation and grief had turned him into something not quite human anymore. Looking at him now, Lila could believe it. He was tall. She could tell that even with him sitting in the saddle, and built like a man who split his own firewood and carried it for miles. His face was weathered and hard, all sharp angles and old scars, with a beard that couldn't quite hide the line of an old knife wound along his jaw. But it was his eyes that frightened her most. They were the color of winter ice, pale blue and utterly cold, and when they finally moved from Vernon to rest on her for just a moment, Lila felt like she was being assessed the same way her father judged a horse at auction. She's healthy enough, Vernon continued, warming to his pitch now. Strong back, used to work, knows how to cook and clean and tend animals. The baby... He waved his hand dismissively at her belly. Well, that's your problem now, not mine. Maybe it'll survive, maybe it won't. But either way, you're getting a woman who can work, and I'm getting the disgrace out of my house. Pa, please. Lila's voice came out small and broken. She hated how weak she sounded, but terror had wrapped itself around her throat like a fist. Quiet, Vernon snapped without looking at her. Then to Jonah. Do we have a deal, Creed? For a long moment, the mountain man said nothing. His pale eyes moved over Lila again, and she forced herself not to flinch, not to show how badly her legs were shaking. Around them, the good people of Dry Creek watched in silence. Mrs. Patterson stood in the doorway of the store, her hand pressed to her mouth. Tom Brewster leaned against the hitching post, his expression carefully neutral. Even Reverend Walsh had stopped on his way to the church, his Bible clutched against his chest, though he made no move to intervene. Finally, slowly, Jonah Creed reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted the coins into his palm. Lila heard the clink of silver, watched the morning light catch on each piece, and then he leaned down from his saddle and held out his hand to Vernon. "Deal," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like he wasn't used to using it much. Vernon snatched the money with barely concealed eagerness, his fingers closing around the coins like a hawk's talons. "She's all yours then. Take her and get out of my sight." He released Lila's arm so suddenly that she stumbled, her hand reaching out to catch herself against the store's wall. The wood was rough and cold beneath her palm, and for a second the world tilted dangerously. This was really happening. Her father had just sold her to a stranger for $500 silver, and no one, not the Reverend, not the sheriff standing outside his office across the street, not a single soul in this town, was going to stop it. Jonah dismounted in one smooth movement and stood before her. Up close he was even taller than she'd thought, and broader too. His coat smelled like pine smoke and winter wind, and there was dried blood on one of his gloves. Animal blood, she hoped, though with the stories about him, she couldn't be certain. "Can you ride?" he asked. Lila looked up at him, at that scarred face and those ice-cold eyes, and shook her head. Not like this. Not with the baby." Something flickered across his expression, too quick for her to read. Then he turned and pulled a thick wool blanket from his saddlebag. "It's a long walk up the mountain. You'll need this." He draped the blanket around her shoulders without touching her more than necessary, and Lila found herself surprised by the simple gentleness of the gesture. The blanket was warm and smelled faintly of wood smoke, and it was the first kindness anyone had shown her in months. "Wait," Vernon's voice cut through the moment. He was counting the coins again, his eyes narrowed. "This is only $490. You're $10 short, Creed." Jonah turned slowly, and Lila saw Vernon actually take a step backward. "No," Jonah said, his voice flat and final. "I'm not." The two men stared at each other, and the tension stretched out like a rope pulled too tight. Finally, Vernon's gaze dropped first. "Fine," he muttered. "Fine. Just take her and go." He turned and walked away without another word, without a goodbye, without even a backward glance at his only daughter. Lila watched him go, watched his straight-backed, righteous stride carry him down the street toward the saloon, and something inside her, something she'd been holding on to since her mother died when she was 8 years old, finally broke and fell away. "Come on," Jonah said quietly. He started walking, leading his horse by the reins, and after a moment Lila followed. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and put one foot in front of the other, past the staring faces, past Mrs. Patterson who couldn't even meet her eyes now, past the church where she'd been baptized as a baby and told that God loved her. Her feet felt heavy, and the baby kicked inside her as if protesting this journey into the unknown. But what choice did she have? Vernon had made his position clear. She was no longer his daughter. She was merchandise, sold and paid for, and her new owner was leading her up into the mountains where, the stories said, the wolves ran and women went to die. The walk out of town felt like it took hours, though it was probably only minutes. Behind them, Lila heard the murmur of voices starting up again, the gossip already spreading like wildfire. By nightfall, everyone within 20 miles would know that Vernon Dale had finally gotten rid of his shameful daughter, that he'd sold her to the mad hermit Jonah Creed for a bag of silver coins. Once they reached the edge of town, where the main street gave way to a rutted dirt road that climbed toward the foothills, Jonah stopped. He pulled another blanket from his saddlebag and spread it on the ground, then gestured to it. "Sit," he said. "Rest a minute." Lila hesitated, then lowered herself carefully onto the blanket. The baby was pressing against her ribs now, making it hard to breathe, and her legs ached from standing so long in the cold. Jonah unslung a canteen from his saddle and held it out to her. "Drink," he said. The water was cold and sweet, mountain-fed and clean, better than anything from the well at her father's ranch. Lila drank gratefully, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. Jonah was checking his horse's hooves, his movements methodical and practiced, giving her space and time without making a show of it. How far is it? She finally asked. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, small and frightened and young. 10 miles, maybe 12, Jonah replied without looking up. We'll take it slow. Stop when you need to. What? She had to force the words out past the fear clogging her throat. What are you going to do with me? Now he did look at her, and for the first time she saw something in those ice-blue eyes besides cold assessment. It might have been surprise, or maybe just weariness. Do with you? My father said... Her voice broke. He said you needed a woman for whatever you do up there in the mountains. Understanding flickered across Jonah's face, followed by something that might have been anger, though not directed at her. He stood up, brushing dirt from his gloves, and when he spoke his voice was carefully controlled. Your father, he said slowly, told me you needed a place to have your baby. Somewhere away from town. He said the shame was killing his reputation, that you needed somewhere to go until the child was born. He said... Jonah paused and his jaw tightened. He said you'd die in childbirth anyway, most likely fat as you are. But if you didn't, I could use the help around the cabin, and the money would help me get through winter. The words hit Lila like physical blows. Her father had sent her into the mountains expecting her to die, hoping she would die. And he'd paid this stranger to take her far enough away that her death wouldn't stain his precious reputation. I see, she whispered. I don't plan on touching you, Jonah said, and there was an odd gentleness in his rough voice now. That's what you're afraid of? I've got a cabin. It's small, but it's sound. There's a separate sleeping area you can have. Food and firewood enough for the winter. I mostly keep to myself, do my own work, and I expect you'll do the same. When spring comes... He trailed off, and Lila realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. Neither had she. When spring comes, I'll probably be dead, Lila said flatly. That's what my father thinks. That's what everyone thinks. Fat women don't survive childbirth. That's what Mrs. Patterson told me. She said God punishes sin with suffering, and I'm sinful, so I'll suffer. Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Then he knelt down so he was at eye level with her, and for the first time she saw past the scars and the hardness to something human underneath. My wife was small, he said quietly. Tiny little thing, barely came up to my shoulder. Everyone said she was delicate, said she was perfect for bearing children. She died screaming, and I couldn't save her or the baby. His voice was level, but she could hear the old agony beneath it, could see it in the way his hands clenched into fists on his knees. So I don't put much stock in what people say about who lives and who dies. Your father's a fool, and Mrs. Patterson is a righteous old crow who wouldn't know God's will from a hole in the ground. Despite everything, despite the fear and the humiliation and the bone-deep exhaustion, Lila felt something like a laugh try to escape her throat. It came out as a strange, choked sound, half sob and half surprise. Jonah stood and held out his hand. Can you walk now? She took his hand. His palm was rough and calloused, his grip careful despite his strength, and let him help her to her feet. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, and he caught it before it hit the ground, shaking it out and draping it back around her with that same unexpected gentleness. Stay close to me, he said, turning back to the road. The path gets rough up ahead, and there are roots that'll trip you if you're not careful. They walked in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning fog and revealing the massive peaks that rose around them like the walls of a fortress. The road, really just a trail now, wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, past boulders as big as houses and streams that ran so clear Lila could see the stones on the bottom. The air grew thinner and colder, and she found herself breathing harder, her lungs working to pull in enough oxygen for herself and the baby both. Jonah set a steady pace, slow enough that she could keep up, but fast enough that they made real progress. Every half hour or so, he would stop without a word and wait while she rested, sometimes offering her water, sometimes just standing quietly beside his horse while she caught her breath. He didn't try to fill the silence with meaningless talk, didn't ask her questions she didn't want to answer, didn't tell her empty reassurances about how everything would be fine. She found herself grateful for that. Words would have felt like lies right now. Around midday, they stopped beside a stream where the water pooled deep and dark before spilling over a rocky ledge. Jonah pulled jerky and hardtack from his saddlebag and handed half to Lila, then sat on a fallen log while she perched carefully on a sun-warmed stone. The jerky was tough and heavily salted, but it was food, and her stomach had been empty since the night before. She ate slowly, washing down each bite with palmfuls of stream water so cold it made her teeth ache. "How far along are you?" Jonah asked abruptly. Lila looked up, surprised by the question. 7 months, I think. Maybe closer to 8. 8? I'm not sure. He nodded, his eyes distant. "My wife, Sarah. She was 7 months when it happened. Doctor said the baby was turned wrong, that even if he'd been there from the start, he probably couldn't have saved either of them." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was so quiet she almost didn't hear it. "But he wasn't there. I was alone with her, and I didn't know what to do. I just held her hand and watched her die." "I'm sorry," Lila said softly, and meant it. Whatever Jonah Creed was, hermit, wolfman, whatever stories they told in Dry Creek, he was also a man who had loved his wife and lost her, and grief was something Lila understood. She'd been grieving her own life for months now, grieving the future she'd imagined with Billy Henderson, grieving her father's love which she now realized had never really existed at all. "That's why I took your father's offer," Jonah continued, still not looking at her. "He said you needed help. Said you were scared and alone and that the baby was coming whether you wanted it or not. I thought maybe this time I could do something right. Maybe this time someone would live." He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were no longer cold. They were full of an old, deep pain that mirrored her own. "I'm not a midwife. I'm not a doctor. But I've birthed calves and foals, and I've got steady hands. When your time comes, I'll do what I can. That's all I can promise." Lila felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them back. "That's more than anyone else has promised me," she said. "My father wanted me dead. The town wanted me gone. You're the only one who even pretends I might survive this." "You'll survive," Jonah said with unexpected firmness. "You're stronger than you know. I can see it in you. The way you're still walking even though you're scared. The way you haven't broken even though they tried to break you. Strong women survive. My Sarah was delicate, and I loved her, but you—" He gestured vaguely at her bulk and her work-roughened hands. "You're built different. You'll live, and your baby will too. I believe that." It was perhaps the kindest thing anyone had said to Lila in her entire life. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby move beneath her palm, and allowed herself the dangerous luxury of hope. They reached the cabin as the sun was starting to dip toward the western peaks, painting the snow-capped mountains in shades of gold and rose. Lila was exhausted, her feet blistered and her back screaming, but when she saw Jonah's home, she felt something in her chest loosen slightly. It wasn't the rough shanty she'd expected. The cabin was sturdy and well-built, constructed from whole logs carefully fitted together and chinked with mud and moss. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, which meant there was a fire inside, which meant warmth. A covered porch ran along the front, and Lila could see stacks of split firewood piled neatly against the wall, enough to last through multiple winters. Behind the cabin, a small barn housed what looked like a milk cow and a few chickens, and beyond that, the forest rose up like a dark green wall. "It's not much," Jonah said, his voice gruff with what might have been embarrassment. "But it's tight and dry, and the stove works well. There's a spring just up the hill that runs year-round, good clean water. It's—" Lila searched for the right word and found only the truth. "It's more than I expected." Jonah led his horse to the barn while Lila stood on the porch, swaying slightly with exhaustion. Every muscle in her body hurt, and the baby was kicking steadily now, as if agitated by the long journey. She pressed her hand to her side, trying to calm the child, and wondered if this was what her life was going to be now. A stranger's cabin in the high mountains, miles from any other human soul, with winter coming on fast and hard. The cabin door swung open, and Jonah emerged with his arms full of firewood. "Come on inside," he said. "Get warm. I'll make us some supper." The interior of the cabin was dim after the bright afternoon outside, but as Lila's eyes adjusted, she took in the details of what would be her home. The main room was perhaps 15 feet square, dominated by a large cast-iron stove that radiated blessed heat. A rough wooden table sat near the stove with two mismatched chairs, and shelves lined one wall holding dishes and supplies. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and thyme. In one corner, a ladder led up to what must be a sleeping loft, and in another, a curtained doorway led to what Jonah had called the separate sleeping area. "That's yours," Jonah said, nodding toward the curtained space. "There's a bed, not fancy, but the mattress is stuffed with fresh straw and the blankets are clean. I sleep up in the loft." Lila pushed aside the heavy canvas curtain and peered into the small room beyond. It was barely big enough for the narrow bed and a wooden chest, but there was a small window that let in light, and someone, Jonah, she assumed, had made up the bed with care. The blankets were thick and worn but clean, and there was even a pillow. "Thank you," she said quietly, turning back to face him. This is kind of you." Jonah shrugged uncomfortably. "Sit down before you fall down. You look dead on your feet." She sank gratefully into one of the chairs at the table and watched as Jonah moved around the cabin with practiced efficiency. He built up the fire in the stove, set a pot of water to boil, and pulled out supplies from various shelves and cupboards: dried meat, beans, onions, salt. His movements were economical and sure. The movements of a man used to taking care of himself, used to solitude. "Can you cook?" he asked without turning around. "Yes," Lila said. "I've been cooking since I was 10, since my mother died." "Good. Winter's long up here, and I'm a decent cook, but not an inspired one. If you can make something besides stew and hardtack, I won't complain." He glanced over his shoulder at her. "But not tonight. Tonight you rest." They ate in silence as darkness fell outside and the temperature dropped. The stew was simple: venison, beans, and onions in a savory broth. But it was hot and filling, and Lila ate 2 bowls before she finally felt satisfied. Jonah ate steadily, methodically, his eyes distant, and Lila wondered what he was thinking. Was he regretting his decision? Was he wondering how he was going to manage with a pregnant woman in his cabin all winter? "I'll earn my keep," she said suddenly. "I'm not asking for charity. I can work, cleaning, cooking, mending, whatever you need. I'm not useless, no matter what my father said." Jonah set down his spoon and looked at her for a long moment. "Your father," he said slowly, "is the kind of man who measures worth in silver coins and reputation. He looks at you and sees shame because you carry another man's child. He looks at me and sees a mountain savage who runs with wolves." His mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile, though there was no humor in it. "We're both better off up here, away from men like him. So you don't owe me anything, Lila Dale. You don't have to earn your right to live." It was the first time he'd spoken her name, and hearing it from him, without scorn, without judgment, made something in Lila's chest crack open. She ducked her head, blinking hard against the sudden sting of tears, and nodded because she didn't trust her voice. After supper, Jonah showed her where things were kept: the water bucket by the door, the wash basin, the privy out back. "Use the chamber pot at night," he told her gruffly. "It's too cold and dark to be stumbling around outside." He gave her one of his shirts to sleep in, an old flannel thing that would be huge on her but would at least be warm, and then he nodded towards her room. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll figure out a routine. But tonight, just sleep." Lila retreated to the small room and closed the canvas curtain behind her. She changed into Jonah's shirt, which did indeed swallow her, the sleeves hanging past her hands and the hem falling nearly to her knees. Then she crawled beneath the blankets on the narrow bed and lay there in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the cabin, the crackle of the fire, the creak of the ladder as Jonah climbed up to the loft, the sigh of the wind outside. She should have been terrified. She was alone in the mountains with a stranger, miles from any help, with a baby growing inside her that might kill her when it finally decided to be born. Her father had sold her like cattle and expected her to die. The whole town thought she deserved whatever fate awaited her. By all rights, she should have been crying into her pillow, should have been drowning in despair. But as Lila lay there in the darkness, listening to the gentle sounds of Jonah settling into sleep above her, she realized something surprising. She felt safer than she had in months, safer than she'd felt in her father's house, where every word was a potential trigger for his rage. Safer than she'd felt in town, where every eye judged her and found her wanting. Here, in this remote cabin with this scarred, grieving stranger, she was just Lila. Not a disgrace, not a burden, just a woman who was going to have a baby, and a man who had promised to help her survive it. For the first time since Billy Henderson had disappeared into the night, Lila allowed herself to sleep without nightmares. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that was both strange and oddly comforting. Jonah woke before dawn every morning. Lila could hear him moving around quietly in the loft, then the creak of the ladder as he climbed down. He would build up the fire and set water to boil, and by the time Lila emerged from her room, there would be coffee brewing and sometimes porridge cooking on the stove. "Morning," he would grunt, and that would be the extent of their conversation until after breakfast. Jonah was a man of few words, Lila quickly learned, but his actions spoke volumes. He never complained about her presence, never made her feel like an imposition, never looked at her with the disgust she'd grown accustomed to seeing in other people's eyes. He simply adjusted his routine to accommodate her, making space at the table, clearing a shelf for her few possessions, showing her where he kept the extra blankets in case she got cold at night. For her part, Lila threw herself into making herself useful. Despite Jonah's insistence that she didn't need to earn her keep, she couldn't stand the thought of being a burden. So she cooked, real food, not just stew and hardtack. She made biscuits and gravy, fried potatoes with wild onions, venison roast with herbs she found hanging from the rafters. She swept the cabin floor and organized the shelves and mended the holes in Jonah's spare clothes. She hauled water from the spring, though Jonah would take the bucket from her hands if he caught her carrying it, muttering about stubborn women who don't know when to rest. She fed the chickens and gathered eggs and learned how to milk the cow, whose name, Jonah told her, was Bess. "She's a good old girl," he said, scratching Bess behind the ears. "Steady and reliable. Never gives me trouble." Lila found herself spending more time than strictly necessary in the barn, talking to Bess while she milked, telling the cow things she couldn't say to Jonah. About how scared she was. About how the baby kicked so hard sometimes it took her breath away. About how she missed her mother, who had died so long ago that Lila could barely remember her face, but who she knew would have loved her no matter what. Bess would turn her big brown eyes toward Lila and chew her cud philosophically, and somehow that was exactly the response Lila needed. The work was hard, especially as her belly grew and her back ached more with each passing day, but it was also grounding. It gave her purpose, gave her a reason to get up in the morning beyond just surviving until the next day. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she began to feel something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Useful. Jonah, meanwhile, spent his days working with a quiet intensity that Lila found almost mesmerizing. He checked his trap lines, bringing back rabbit and occasional fox. He chopped firewood, his axe rising and falling with mechanical precision, the crack of splitting logs echoing across the valley. He repaired the barn roof before the heavy snows came, and reinforced the chicken coop against predators, and did 100 other small tasks that kept them safe and fed and warm. And in the evenings, after supper, he would sometimes pull out a piece of wood and a carving knife and work by the light of the fire, his hands steady and patient as he shaped the wood into something beautiful. Lila watched from her chair, her own hands busy with mending, and wondered what he was making. One night, nearly 2 weeks after her arrival, she finally asked, "What are you carving?" Jonah looked up, surprised. Then he held out the piece of wood so she could see. It was a small horse, no bigger than her palm, with a flowing mane and tail. The detail was extraordinary. She could see the individual muscles beneath the carved hide, the intelligence in the wooden eyes. "It's beautiful," Lila breathed. "It's for—" Jonah stopped, his jaw tightening. Then he turned the horse over in his hands, his thumb running over the smooth wood. "It was supposed to be for my son. Sarah wanted a boy. She had names picked out and everything. She used to tell me stories about what he'd be like, how I'd teach him to ride and hunt and take care of himself in the mountains." His voice was low and rough, full of old grief. "After she died, I kept carving, couldn't seem to stop. There's a whole box of them up in the loft. Horses and wolves and bears and rabbits. Too many toys for a child who never lived." Lila's throat tightened. She set down her mending and reached across the table, her hand hovering for a moment before she gently touched Jonah's wrist. He went very still, his eyes fixed on her hand. "Maybe—" She had to stop and swallow past the lump in her throat. Maybe someday there will be a child who needs them. Maybe they're just waiting. Jonah looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. An understanding, a shared recognition of loss and hope tangled together. Then he nodded once and went back to his carving. But Lila thought she saw his shoulders relax slightly, as if some burden had been eased. The moment passed, but something had shifted. After that night, Jonah began to talk more. Not a lot, he was still a man of few words, but enough that the silence in the cabin felt companionable rather than oppressive. He told her about the mountains, about the way the seasons changed up here, and what to expect when the heavy snows came. He showed her which herbs were good for what ailments, which plants were safe to eat, and which would make her sick. He taught her how to read the sky for coming storms and how to move quietly through the forest without startling the animals. And Lila, in turn, began to share small pieces of herself. She told him about her mother, who had been kind and gentle and had died of a fever when Lila was 10. She told him about growing up with Vernon, who had grown harder and colder after his wife's death, who had channeled his grief into righteousness and his righteousness into cruelty. She told him about Billy Henderson, though the telling made her feel ashamed and small. "He said he loved me," she said quietly one evening, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "He said we'd get married and have a family and be happy. And I believed him because I wanted so badly for someone to love me. When I told him about the baby, he just left. Didn't even say goodbye." The next day his parents said he'd gone east to find work, but everyone knew the truth. He ran away because he didn't want to be tied down to a fat girl with a bastard child. "He was a coward," Jonah said flatly. "A real man doesn't run from his responsibilities. A real man stands by the woman carrying his child, no matter what anyone else thinks." "Well, there aren't many real men in Dry Creek then," Lila said bitterly. "No," Jonah agreed. "There aren't. That's why I left." It was the first time he'd mentioned anything about his life before the mountain, before Sarah. Lila looked up, curious, but Jonah's face had closed off again, and she knew better than to push. 3 weeks into her stay, the first heavy snow came. Lila woke to an eerie silence and pushed aside the curtain to find the world transformed. Snow blanketed everything, the porch, the roof of the barn, the trees, in a pure white mantle that glittered in the pale morning light. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, a reminder of just how isolated they were, how far from any help. Jonah was already outside, shoveling a path from the cabin to the barn. Lila watched him through the small window, watched the easy rhythm of his work, the way his breath puffed white in the cold air. He'd told her the snow would come, had prepared for it, but seeing it was different from hearing about it. This was real. This was winter in the high country, and it would be months before the passes cleared enough for travel. She was trapped here now, for better or worse, until spring. The thought should have terrified her, but as Lila pulled on her heaviest shawl and went to start breakfast, she realized it didn't. Trapped implied she was a prisoner, but she didn't feel like a prisoner. She felt safe. Hidden, maybe, but in a good way. The snow was a barrier between her and the world that had rejected her, between her and Vernon Dale and Billy Henderson and all the righteous people of Dry Creek who had watched her humiliation without lifting a finger to help. Let them think what they wanted. Let them tell their stories about the mad hermit and the disgraced daughter. Up here, in this cabin, with this quiet, grieving man and the life growing inside her, Lila was starting to feel like she might actually survive. And more than that, she was starting to feel like she might deserve to. The days grew shorter and the cold more intense. Jonah had been right about the work, though. There was always something to do, and staying busy kept Lila from dwelling too much on what was coming. The baby would be here soon, maybe by Christmas, maybe sooner. She could feel it dropping lower, getting ready, and sometimes the fear would grip her so hard she could barely breathe. But then Jonah would appear with firewood, or Bess would moo at her through the barn wall, or she'd catch the smell of bread baking and remember that she was here, she was alive, and she had made it this far already. Whatever came next, she would face it. She had no other choice. One evening, about a month after her arrival, Lila was washing dishes when she felt something wet and warm running down her legs. For a moment she just stood there, confused, and then understanding crashed over her like a wave. "Jonah," she said, her voice surprisingly calm considering the terror spiking through her veins. Jonah, I think it's time. He appeared in the doorway from the porch, his arms full of firewood. For just a second, his eyes went wide, and Lila saw the same fear she felt reflected back at her. Then his jaw set and he was moving, dropping the wood, grabbing blankets from the shelf, speaking in that low, steady voice. All right, he said. All right, it's going to be fine. Let's get you to the bed. Can you walk? I think so. But when she tried to move, a contraction hit her like a fist to the gut and she gasped, her hand shooting out to grip the edge of the table. Jonah was there instantly, his arm around her waist, supporting her weight. Breathe, he said. Just breathe through it. That's good. That's good. He helped her to the small room and eased her down onto the bed, his movements gentle despite the urgency of the situation. Then he was everywhere at once, stoking the fire, boiling water, gathering clean cloths, doing all the things he'd learned from watching his own wife die and being determined not to let it happen again. Jonah, Lila gasped between contractions. I'm scared. He knelt beside the bed and took her hand, his grip strong and warm. I know, he said. I'm scared too. But we're going to get through this together. You hear me? You're not alone. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. And as the night descended and the pain grew worse and the baby fought its way into the world, Jonah kept his promise. He stayed. The pain came in waves that threatened to pull Lila under, each contraction stronger than the last, each one making her wonder if she would survive the next. She'd heard women talk about childbirth before, whispered conversations in the general store, her mother's friends speaking in low voices they thought children couldn't hear. But nothing had prepared her for this. Nothing had prepared her for the feeling that her body was being torn apart from the inside, that some force beyond her control had taken over and was determined to rip her open. I can't do this, she gasped, her fingers digging into Jonah's arm hard enough to leave marks. Jonah, I can't. Yes, you can. His voice was steady, anchoring her when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. You're doing it right now. Just breathe. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. That's good. The cabin had become a world unto itself, lit by the warm glow of oil lamps and the fire crackling in the stove. Jonah had transformed the small room into something between a bedroom and a battlefield, with clean cloths stacked on the wooden chest, a basin of hot water steaming on the floor, and his sleeves rolled up to his elbows like a man preparing for hard work. His face was drawn tight with concentration, but his hands were gentle as he pressed a cool cloth to Lila's forehead. How long? She managed to ask between contractions. A few hours now, Jonah said. It's going to be a while yet. First babies take their time. How do you know? The words came out sharper than she intended, born of pain and fear rather than real anger. Jonah's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said quietly, Sarah was in labor for 18 hours. I know every minute of what those hours feel like, watching someone you care about suffer and not being able to take the pain away. Did she? Lila had to stop as another contraction gripped her, this one so intense that white spots danced in her vision. When she could breathe again, she finished the question. Did she scream? Yes. Jonah's voice was raw. Toward the end, yes. She screamed until her voice gave out, and I held her hand and felt like the most useless man God ever made. He met Lila's eyes, and she saw the old agony there, still fresh despite the years. But you're not Sarah. You're stronger than she was, stronger in body, if not in will. And this time I know more. This time I'm not a terrified boy who doesn't know which end is up. So you're going to scream if you need to, and I'm going to help you, and we're both going to get through this. You understand me? Lila nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Another contraction was building. She could feel it gathering like a storm, and when it hit, she did scream, a raw animal sound that echoed off the cabin walls and seemed to shake the very foundations. Jonah didn't flinch. He just kept his hand on her back, rubbing in small circles, and when the contraction passed, he helped her shift position, his touch careful and clinical despite the intimacy of the situation. That's it, he murmured. You're doing good. Real good. The hours blurred together after that. Day became night, became day again, though Lila lost track of time somewhere in the endless cycle of pain and brief respite. Jonah stayed with her through all of it, never leaving her side except to fetch more water or stoke the fire. He talked to her in that low, steady voice, telling her stories about the mountains, about the wolves he'd seen running across the snow at dawn, about the time a bear had tried to get into his food cache, and he'd had to chase it off with nothing but a frying pan and his own stubbornness. "Damn thing looked at me like I'd lost my mind," Jonah said, during one of the brief lulls when Lila could focus on something besides the pain. But then he turned tail and ran, and I stood there in my long underwear holding a cast iron pan and thinking Sarah would have laughed herself sick if she'd seen it. "Tell me about her," Lila whispered. "Tell me about Sarah." Jonah's hands stilled for a moment in their work. Then he resumed checking her pulse, his fingers gentle on her wrist. "She was small," he said finally. "Came up to about here on me." He gestured to his chest. "Had hair the color of wheat and eyes like a summer sky. She laughed all the time, at everything, at nothing, just because she was happy to be alive. I met her in town when I was buying supplies, and she smiled at me, and that was it. I was gone." "How long were you married?" 3 years. Best 3 years of my life, even with how it ended." His voice roughened. "She wanted children so badly. Used to talk about filling this cabin with babies, about teaching them to read and ride and be good people. When she finally got pregnant, she was happier than I'd ever seen her. And then—" He didn't finish, didn't need to. Lila understood loss, understood how joy could turn to ash in a heartbeat. She squeezed his hand weakly, and he squeezed back. The contractions were coming closer together now, barely any rest between them, and Lila felt like she was drowning in the pain. Her body was doing things she had no control over, bearing down with a force that terrified her. She was too big. The baby was too big. Something was wrong. It had to be wrong. "Lila, look at me." Jonah's face swam into focus above her, his ice blue eyes intense. "Look at me. You're doing fine. Everything is progressing exactly like it should. I can see the baby's head. Do you hear me? I can see your baby. Just a little more, just a few more pushes." "I can't," she sobbed. "Jonah, I can't. It hurts too much." "You can, and you will." His voice was firm now, commanding. "You've come this far. You've survived your father selling you. You've walked 12 miles up a mountain 7 months pregnant. You've lived through this whole damn winter waiting for this moment. You don't get to quit now. This baby is counting on you, and I'll be damned if I let either of you give up. Now push." So she pushed. She pushed with everything she had left, pushed until she felt like her body was going to tear in half, pushed until the world narrowed down to nothing but pain and Jonah's voice and the desperate need to get this baby out. And then, suddenly, there was a release, a sliding, rushing sensation, and a thin wail split the air. "You did it," Jonah said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "Lila, you did it. You've got a son." She couldn't see clearly through her tears, but she could hear the baby crying, strong, healthy, angry cries that filled the cabin and drove away the silence of the long night. Jonah was moving quickly now, his hands sure, despite their trembling, cutting the cord and wrapping the baby in clean cloth. Then he was placing the tiny bundle in Lila's arms, and she was looking down at a red, wrinkled face and a shock of dark hair, and her heart cracked wide open. "Hello," she whispered. "Hello, little one. I'm your mama." The baby's cries quieted at the sound of her voice, and unfocused dark eyes seemed to try to find her face. One tiny fist waved in the air, and Lila caught it gently, marveling at the perfect miniature fingers, the pearlescent nails no bigger than grains of rice. He was real. He was alive. And he was hers. "He's perfect," Jonah said hoarsely. He was standing beside the bed, and when Lila looked up, she saw tears on his scarred face, the first tears she'd seen from this hard, stoic man. "You did it, Lila. You brought him through." "We did it," she corrected softly. "I couldn't have done this without you, Jonah. You saved us both." He shook his head, but before he could argue, the baby let out another cry, this one clearly hungry. Lila looked down at her son, then up at Jonah, sudden uncertainty flooding through her. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I don't know how to—" "I'll help," Jonah said quickly. My mother had 6 children. I watched her with the youngest ones. Here, he showed her gently, his touch clinical and respectful, and after a few fumbling attempts the baby latched on and began to nurse with single-minded determination. Lila leaned back against the pillows Jonah had piled behind her, exhausted beyond measure, but unable to look away from the miracle in her arms. The baby's little fist kneaded against her breast as he nursed, and she traced the curve of his cheek with one finger, still hardly able to believe he was real. "What will you name him?" Jonah asked quietly. Lila hadn't thought about names, had been too scared to let herself imagine that the baby might actually live. But now, looking down at this tiny person who had fought his way into the world with such determination, a name came to her. "Samuel," she said, "after my mother's father. He died before I was born, but my mother used to tell me he was the kindest man she ever knew. I want my son to be kind." She looked up at Jonah. "Is that all right?" "It's your son," Jonah said. "You call him whatever feels right." But she could see the approval in his eyes, and something else, a softness she hadn't seen before, a glimpse of the man he must have been before grief hardened him. The baby, Samuel, fell asleep at her breast, his tiny mouth going slack, and Lila felt her own eyes growing heavy. She'd been awake for over 24 hours, had pushed her body through an ordeal she'd been convinced would kill her, and now the exhaustion was catching up with vengeance. But she was afraid to close her eyes, afraid that if she did, this would all turn out to be a dream. "Sleep," Jonah said gently, taking the baby from her arms with practiced care. "I'll watch over him. You need to rest and recover your strength. But what if I raised calves and foals, remember? I know how to hold a baby, and if he needs you, I'll wake you. Now sleep, Lila. You've earned it." She wanted to argue, but her body had other ideas. Almost before Jonah had finished speaking, Lila felt herself slipping into a deep, dreamless sleep, the first truly restful sleep she'd had since Billy Henderson had told her he was leaving. When she woke, pale winter sunlight was streaming through the small window, and the cabin was warm and quiet. For a moment she lay still, trying to orient herself, and then memory came flooding back. The baby. Samuel. She sat up too quickly and immediately regretted it, her body protesting the movement with a dozen different aches. "Easy," Jonah's voice came from near the stove. "Don't rush it. You've been through hell." Lila turned to see him sitting in one of the chairs at the table, her son cradled in his arms. Jonah was rocking slightly, an unconscious motion, and he was humming something under his breath, a tune Lila didn't recognize but that sounded like a lullaby. Samuel was awake, his unfocused eyes gazing up at Jonah's face, and there was something about the picture they made, this scarred, grieving man in this brand new life, that made Lila's throat tighten. "Has he been fussing?" she asked. "A bit. I gave him sugar water like my mother used to do. Seemed to settle him." Jonah looked up, and in the morning light his face looked younger, less haunted. "How do you feel?" "Like I was run over by a wagon," Lila said honestly. "But alive, I'm alive, and he's alive, and that's more than I thought I'd get." "You did good." Jonah stood and brought the baby over to her, placing him gently in her arms. "Real good. Sarah was small and delicate, but you're built for this. Strong. Your son is lucky to have you." Samuel began to root around, making small mewling sounds, and Lila knew he was hungry again. Jonah retreated to give her privacy, busying himself at the stove, and Lila heard the clatter of pans and the smell of coffee brewing. After the baby had nursed and fallen back asleep, Jonah brought her a plate of eggs and biscuits and the best cup of coffee she'd ever tasted. "Eat," he ordered. "You need to keep your strength up. The next few weeks are going to be hard. Babies are demanding little creatures, and you're still recovering." Lila ate gratefully, surprised by how hungry she was. While she ate, Jonah cleaned up the mess from the birth with quiet efficiency, carrying out soiled cloths and linens, scrubbing the floor, restoring order to the small room. He worked like a man used to taking care of unpleasant necessities, and Lila found herself grateful once again for his presence. What would she have done without him? How would she have survived this alone? The days that followed were both harder and easier than Lila had expected. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known were possible, and there were moments when she wondered if she'd ever feel normal again. But Samuel was thriving. He was a good baby, sleeping in stretches of 3 or 4 hours and nursing with enthusiastic determination. And Jonah, to her surprise, proved to be remarkably helpful. He'd bring the baby to her in the middle of the night when Samuel's cries woke them both. He'd hold the boy while Lila ate or bathed, or just needed a moment to herself. He'd pace the floor with Samuel against his shoulder when the baby had gas, patting his tiny back and humming that same tuneless lullaby. And he'd carved a cradle. Lila woke one morning to find it beside her bed, beautifully made with rockers that moved smoothly and silently. "When did you make this?" she asked, running her hand over the smooth wood. "Last few weeks," Jonah said, not meeting her eyes. "Figured you'd need it. It's beautiful. Thank you." He shrugged uncomfortably, the way he always did when she thanked him, and went back to chopping vegetables for dinner. But Lila saw the slight curve of his mouth, the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him, and she felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. 2 weeks after Samuel's birth, Lila was finally strong enough to venture outside the cabin for the first time. The world was buried under 3 feet of snow, the sky a brilliant blue that hurt to look at, and the air so cold it burned her lungs. But it felt like freedom. She stood on the porch with Samuel bundled against her chest in a sling Jonah had fashioned from an old shirt, and she breathed deeply. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Jonah said beside her. He'd been chopping wood, and sweat steamed off his shoulders despite the cold. "Yes," Lila said. "Beautiful and terrifying. That's the mountains. They don't suffer fools, but if you respect them, they'll provide for you." He set down his axe and leaned against the porch railing, looking out at the white expanse. "Used to be I'd go weeks without seeing another soul up here. Liked it that way. But now—" He trailed off, and Lila glanced at him curiously. "But now the cabin feels different. Fuller. Better, maybe." He looked at her, then quickly away. "Not saying I'm glad your father sold you off like cattle, but I'm glad you're here, glad the boy is here. Place feels less like a tomb and more like a home." It was the most personal thing he'd said to her, and Lila felt her heart squeeze. "I'm glad I'm here too," she said softly. "I know that probably sounds crazy given how I got here, but up here, with you, I feel safer than I ever did in my father's house. You've been kinder to me than anyone in my whole life," Jonah creed. He ducked his head, clearly uncomfortable with the praise. "Just doing what's right." "No," Lila said firmly. "Most men wouldn't have done what you did. Most men would have—" She didn't finish, didn't need to. They both knew what some men would have done with a pregnant woman sold to them for silver coins. "I'm not most men," Jonah said quietly. "And you're not property, no matter what your father thinks. You're a person. You deserve to be treated like one." Samuel chose that moment to wake and let out a small cry, and Lila rocked him gently, soothing him back to sleep. When she looked up, Jonah was watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between longing and pain and a tentative sort of hope. "Do you want to hold him?" she asked impulsively. Jonah hesitated. "I don't want to impose—" "You're not. Here." She carefully transferred Samuel to Jonah's arms, showing him how to support the baby's head. Jonah held the boy stiffly at first, like he was afraid he might break, but after a moment his posture relaxed. He looked down at Samuel's tiny face with wonder, one calloused finger stroking the baby's soft cheek. "Hey there, little man," Jonah murmured. "You're a fighter, aren't you? Came into this world screaming like a mountain lion. Your mama did good bringing you through." Samuel yawned, his tiny mouth forming a perfect O, and Jonah's expression softened into something Lila had never seen before, pure, unguarded tenderness. It was the face of a man who had loved a child once and lost it, who had carved 100 toys for a son who never lived, who had convinced himself he would never have this moment again. "He likes you," Lila said. "He's asleep. He doesn't even know I'm here." "Yes, he does. Babies can tell when they're safe. He knows you won't hurt him." Jonah looked at her, and there was something raw in his eyes. "Sarah and I, we were going to name our son Jacob, after her father. I had it all planned out, how I'd teach him to hunt and fish, how Sarah would teach him to read, how we'd be a family up here in the mountains." His voice roughened, but then she died, and Jacob died, and I thought that was it. Thought God or fate or whatever runs this world had decided I didn't deserve that kind of happiness. And now? Lila asked gently. Now I've got a woman and a baby in my cabin, and they're both alive, and I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong. Maybe I get a second chance after all. He carefully handed Samuel back to Lila, his movements reluctant. Not saying I deserve it, but I'm grateful for it all the same. They stood together in the cold, watching the winter sun climb higher, and Lila felt something shift between them, something deeper than gratitude, more complex than simple companionship. She couldn't name it yet, wasn't sure she was ready to, but it was there all the same, growing slowly like a seed beneath the snow. As the weeks passed and Samuel grew from a tiny newborn into a more substantial baby, the cabin fell into new rhythms. Jonah would wake first and build up the fire, then check on the animals while Lila nursed the baby. After breakfast, which Lila had taken back over cooking, much to Jonah's obvious relief, Jonah would head out to check his trap lines or chop wood or do the 100 other tasks that kept them alive in the high country. Lila would spend the morning caring for Samuel, doing small chores around the cabin, and learning to navigate motherhood one fumbling step at a time. In the evenings, they would eat dinner together and then sit by the fire. Jonah had brought down the box of carved toys from the loft, and now they sat on a shelf where Lila could see them, a testament to grief transformed into something beautiful. Sometimes Jonah would carve new ones while Lila mended or knitted. She was teaching herself to make tiny clothes for Samuel, her stitches clumsy at first, but improving with practice. "That hat looks like it'll fit a pumpkin, not a baby," Jonah observed one evening, squinting at her handiwork. Lila laughed, a sound that was becoming more common in the cabin. "Well, he's growing fast. Maybe he'll grow into it. Or maybe you should try again with fewer stitches." "Oh, you're an expert knitter now, are you?" "No, but I've got eyes. That thing's big enough for a grown man." Lila threw a ball of yarn at him, which he caught easily, his mouth quirking into what was almost a smile. These moments of easy teasing had become precious to her, proof that life could include joy even after everything she'd been through, that laughter wasn't something she'd lost forever back in Dry Creek. Samuel was 6 weeks old when the trouble started. It came in the form of a traveling trader named Pike, who made his rounds through the high country even in winter, bringing supplies and news to the scattered cabins and mining camps. Jonah had gone down to meet him at a crossing point 5 miles from the cabin, taking a list of things they needed: flour, sugar, coffee, fabric for diapers. He returned just before dusk, his face grim and his movements tight with tension. He unloaded the supplies without a word, stacking them by the door with more force than necessary. Lila watched him, Samuel asleep in her arms, and knew something was wrong. "What is it?" she finally asked. "What happened?" Jonah finished with the supplies and came to sit at the table, his hands clenched into fists. "Pike brought news from Dry Creek." Lila's stomach dropped. "What kind of news?" "Your father's telling everyone you were stolen. Says I took you against your will, that I'm keeping you prisoner up here. Says you're probably dead by now, killed by the mountain savage who runs with wolves." Jonah's voice was bitter. "He's got half the town convinced I'm some kind of monster, and the other half doesn't care enough to question him." "But that's not true," Lila said, anger surging through her. "He sold me to you. Everyone saw it." "Everyone knows. What they know and what they'll admit to are different things," Jonah cut her off. "Vernon Dale is a respected man in Dry Creek. He owns land, he goes to church, he's got friends in the right places. Me? I'm the crazy hermit who lives in the mountains. If it comes down to his word against mine, who do you think they'll believe?" Lila's grip tightened on Samuel. "What does this mean?" "It means your father's building a case against me. Pike said there's talk of men riding up here come spring, soon as the pass is clear. Said some of them are saying I ought to be hanged for stealing Vernon Dale's daughter." Jonah's jaw was tight with suppressed rage. Never mind that the bastard sold you for $500 silver. Never mind that he was happy enough to be rid of you when it suited him. Now he wants to play the grieving father, and people are eating it up. "He doesn't want me back," Lila said slowly, understanding dawning. "He wants to erase what he did. If I'm dead, killed by the crazy mountain man, then he's blameless. He's the victim." That's about the size of it. Jonah stood and began to pace, his agitation too great to contain. Damn it! I should have known he'd pull something like this. Should have gotten something in writing, some proof. You didn't know, Lila interrupted. Neither of us did. We were both just trying to survive. Well, surviving's about to get a lot harder. Jonah stopped at the window, staring out at the darkening mountains. If men come up here looking for trouble, if they're worked up thinking I've harmed you, it could get ugly fast, real ugly. Fear coiled in Lila's stomach, cold and sharp. What do we do? For now? Nothing. The passes won't clear for another 2 months at least, maybe 3. That gives us time to prepare. Jonah turned back to face her, and his expression was hard. But when spring comes, when those men ride up here, you need to be ready to tell them the truth. Tell them your father sold you. Tell them I never laid a hand on you except to help you. Tell them... He stopped, his voice rough. Tell them you want to stay. Of course I want to stay, Lila said fiercely. Where else would I go? Back to my father who wanted me dead? Back to Dry Creek, where everyone thinks I'm a whore and my son is a bastard? This cabin is the only home I've got, Jonah. You're the only family Samuel and I have. Something flickered in Jonah's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or gratitude, or something deeper he wasn't ready to name. All right, then. We'll face it together when the time comes. But for now, we keep our heads down and get through the winter. But winter, Lila was learning, had its own plans. The storm came in late February, roaring down from the peaks with a fury that shook the cabin walls. Snow fell so thick and fast that Lila couldn't see the barn from the porch, and the wind screamed like a living thing trying to tear the world apart. Jonah had brought in extra firewood the day before, sensing the storm's approach, and now they were sealed inside while nature raged outside. Samuel was fussy, picking up on the tension in the air, and Lila walked the floor with him, trying to calm both him and herself. The wind made her nervous, made her think of her father's anger, of Billy Henderson's abandonment, of all the times in her life when forces beyond her control had torn her world apart. He'll be fine, Jonah said quietly. He was sitting at the table, methodically cleaning his rifle. Not because it needed cleaning, Lila suspected, but because he needed something to do with his hands. Babies can feel when their mothers are scared. Try to relax. Easy for you to say, Lila muttered, but she forced herself to take a deep breath to loosen her shoulders. Samuel's cries quieted to fussing, and eventually he settled against her shoulder, his tiny fist tangled in her hair. The storm lasted 3 days. On the first day, they stayed busy with small tasks, cooking, cleaning, mending. On the second day, the cabin fever started to set in, and they moved around each other with careful politeness, both trying not to crowd the other in the small space. On the third day, with the wind still howling and the walls creaking under the onslaught, Jonah pulled out a worn deck of cards and taught Lila to play poker. Sarah used to win all my money, he said, dealing the cards with practiced ease. Woman had a face like an angel and the poker instincts of a riverboat gambler. Did you let her win? Lila asked, picking up her cards. Hell no. She won fair and square, and she'd have been insulted if I'd gone easy on her. He studied his hand, then discarded 2 cards. She was competitive about the strangest things. Didn't care about who chopped more wood or who could shoot straighter, but card games and checkers? She played to win. Lila smiled, liking this glimpse into Jonah's past, into the man he'd been before grief carved away everything soft. Tell me more about her. So Jonah talked, his voice low under the howl of the wind, and Lila learned about Sarah Creed, how she'd loved wildflowers and had filled the cabin with them every summer, how she'd sung while she cooked, how she'd been terrified of spiders but would walk right up to a bear if she thought it was threatening their garden. She learned how Sarah and Jonah had met, how he'd been too shy to speak to her at first, and how she'd had to practically drag the proposal out of him. She learned about their wedding day, a small ceremony in Dry Creek before they'd retreated to the mountains, and about the 3 happy years that followed. I loved her, Jonah said simply. Loved her more than I thought I could love anything. When she died, it felt like half of me died too. I came up here afterward and I told myself I'd never come down, never let anyone close again. Seemed safer that way. Couldn't lose someone if you never let yourself care. But you took me in, Lila said softly. I did. Jonah looked at her across the table, cards forgotten in his hands. Told myself it was just a business arrangement, that I was helping you because it was the right thing to do. But somewhere along the way, he trailed off, shaking his head. You and Samuel, you've changed things. This cabin doesn't feel like a tomb anymore. It feels like it did when Sarah was alive. Like a home. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to fully examine. Outside, the storm began to ease, the wind dropping from a scream to a moan. Samuel stirred in his cradle, making small, sleepy sounds, and Lila stood to check on him. "Thank you," she said quietly, not looking at Jonah. "For everything. For saving me and Samuel, for giving us a place to live, for making me feel like I might be worth something after all." "You are worth something." Jonah's voice was rough. "You're worth more than your father ever gave you credit for, more than that Henderson boy deserved. You're strong and brave, and you brought a child into this world with nothing but grit and determination. Don't let anyone, not Vernon, not the town, not anyone, make you believe you're less than you are." Lila turned to face him, tears prickling at her eyes. "Do you really believe that?" "I do." Jonah stood and crossed to where she stood beside the cradle. He looked down at Samuel, sleeping peacefully despite the storm, and something in his expression softened. "I see you with him, see how you fight for him, how you do anything to keep him safe and loved. That's real strength, Lila. That's the kind of strength that matters." They stood close in the firelight, close enough that Lila could feel the warmth radiating from Jonah's body, could smell the pine smoke and wood smoke scent that always clung to him. For a moment she thought he might touch her, a hand on her shoulder perhaps, or a gesture of comfort, but he didn't. He just looked at her with those ice-blue eyes that weren't cold anymore, that were full of something warm and complicated and still unnamed. "We should get some sleep," he said finally. "Storm's passing. Tomorrow we'll need to dig out." Lila nodded and retreated to her small room, but sleep was a long time coming. She lay in the darkness, listening to Samuel's soft breathing and the quieting wind, and thought about Jonah Creed, about the scarred, grieving man who had saved her life without even knowing her, about the way he held her son with such gentleness, the way he'd stayed with her through the worst night of her life, the way he made her feel safe in a world that had never been safe before. She thought about Sarah Creed, too, about the woman who had filled this cabin with love and laughter, whose loss still echoed in every corner. Lila didn't want to replace Sarah. She could never do that. Wouldn't try. But maybe, just maybe, there was room in this cabin for new love alongside old grief. Maybe broken people could heal together, could build something lasting from the wreckage of their shattered lives. The storm ended sometime in the night, and when Lila woke the next morning, the world outside was silent and white and somehow peaceful. Jonah was already up, shoveling a path to the barn, and Samuel was making his hungry morning sounds. Lila fed the baby, then bundled him up and ventured outside. The snow had drifted higher than her waist in places, and everything was transformed. The rough edges of the world softened and made beautiful by the white blanket. Jonah looked up from his shoveling, his breath puffing white in the cold air, and smiled at her. It was a real smile, not just the slight curve of his mouth she'd grown used to, and it transformed his whole face. "Thought you'd sleep later," he called. "Couldn't. Too beautiful out here." Lila picked her way carefully down the steps, Samuel secure against her chest. "How long will it take to dig out?" "Most of the day, but we've got food and firewood, and the animals are fine. No rush." He leaned on his shovel, studying her. "You look different this morning." "Different how?" "Happier, maybe. Less scared." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "It's a good look on you." Lila felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold. "I feel different. Stronger, I think. Like maybe I can handle whatever comes next." "You can," Jonah said with certainty. "You already have." He went back to shoveling, and Lila went to check on the chickens, and the morning passed in companionable work. By afternoon, they'd cleared paths to the barn and the woodpile and the privy, and the cabin felt less like a fortress under siege and more like a home again. That evening, Jonah brought out the carved toys and set them on the floor near Samuel's cradle. "He's too young for them yet," Jonah said, almost apologetically, "but in a few months, when he can sit up and grab things, he'll want something to play with." "They're perfect," Lila said, picking up one of the carved horses. "He's going to love them." And standing there in the warm cabin with Samuel sleeping peacefully and Jonah beside her, Lila realized something that should have terrified her but didn't. She was falling in love. Not with some charming boy who made empty promises, but with a scarred, complicated man who showed his care through actions rather than words. A man who had saved her life, who held her son like he was precious, who made her feel safe for the first time she could remember. She didn't say anything. It was too soon, too fragile, too dangerous to speak aloud. But she felt it blooming in her chest like flowers under snow, waiting for spring. What Lila didn't know was that spring, when it came, would bring more than just melted snow and new growth. It would bring men with guns and anger in their hearts, and a reckoning that would test everything she and Jonah had built together in their mountain sanctuary. But for now, in the deep winter silence, they were safe, and that was enough. Spring came slowly to the high country, reluctant and hesitant, as if the mountains themselves were trying to hold back what was coming. The snow began to soften first around the south-facing rocks, revealing patches of brown earth and the first brave shoots of green. The stream that ran past Jonah's cabin, frozen solid since December, started to crack and gurgle with meltwater. And every day, Lila watched the passes and felt her stomach tighten with dread. Samuel was nearly 4 months old now, a chubby, happy baby who had discovered his own hands and spent long minutes studying them with intense fascination. He could roll over, could grasp the carved toys Jonah made for him, and had recently started making sounds that were almost words, ma and da, and nonsense syllables that made Lila's heart squeeze with fierce love. He had Lila's dark eyes and what looked like it might be Billy Henderson's lighter hair, though Lila tried not to think about that too much. Samuel was hers, only hers, and the man who had fathered him had given up any right to claim him the night he'd run away. "He's getting big," Jonah observed one morning, watching Samuel wave his fists from his spot on a blanket near the stove. "Strong, too. Look at how he holds his head up." "He's perfect," Lila said, as she did every time Jonah commented on the baby's progress. She was kneading bread dough, her hands working the sticky mass with practiced motions she'd learned from her mother years ago. Do you think they'll really come?" She didn't have to specify who they were. It was the question that had hung between them for weeks now, ever since Pike had brought the news about Vernon's poison lies. Every day that the snow melted was another day closer to the pass's clearing, another day closer to confrontation. Jonah was sitting at the table, oiling his rifle. He'd been doing that a lot lately, checking his weapons, counting his ammunition, preparing for trouble he hoped wouldn't come, but knew probably would. "Yes," he said flatly. "They'll come. Men like your father don't let things go, especially not when their pride is involved. He spent the whole winter building his story, convincing people he's a victim. Come spring, he'll want to prove it." "What will we do?" Lila's hand stilled in the dough. "If they come with guns, if they're looking for a fight, then they'll find one." Jonah's voice was hard. "I won't let them take you, Lila. I won't let them take Samuel. This is your home now, and I'll defend it. I don't want you to die for us." The words burst out before she could stop them, raw and frightened. "Jonah, if it comes down to a fight, if my father and his men, I'm not planning on dying." Jonah looked up from his rifle, his ice blue eyes intense. "But I'm not planning on backing down either. Your father sold you. Everyone in Dry Creek saw it happen. If he's rewriting history now, if he's painting himself as the grieving father, that's on him. But the truth is still the truth, and I'll stand by it." Lila went back to kneading, but her movements were agitated now, the dough suffering under her rough handling. "The truth doesn't always matter, not when the person lying has money and respect and friends. My father could say anything and people would believe him, but you're the mountain hermit, the man who runs with wolves. Who's going to take your word over his?" "You are." Jonah set down his rifle and came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her, but his presence was solid and reassuring. "You're going to tell them what happened. You're going to look those men in the eye and tell them your father sold you for $500 silver, that I never laid a hand on you except to help you, that you and Samuel are here because you want to be. And they're going to have to decide if they want to call you a liar to your face." "What if they do?" Lila's voice was small. "What if they think I'm lying to protect you, or that you've scared me into saying what you want?" "Then we'll deal with that when it comes." Jonah reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and put his hand over hers where it rested on the dough. His palm was warm and rough with calluses, and Lila found herself turning her hand over to grip his fingers. But you're stronger than you think, Lila. You've survived everything they've thrown at you. You'll survive this too. Samuel chose that moment to let out a cry, not distressed, just wanting attention. And the moment broke. Jonah released Lila's hand and went to pick up the baby, lifting him with the easy confidence he'd developed over the past months. He held Samuel against his shoulder and walked to the window, bouncing slightly, and Lila watched them silhouetted against the morning light. They looked like a father and son. The thought came unbidden, and Lila felt her breath catch. Jonah wasn't Samuel's father. Billy Henderson was, though he'd never know his child, would never deserve to. But Jonah was the one who'd been there when Samuel was born, who'd stayed up through long nights when the baby was fussy, who'd carved toys and built a cradle and made sure both mother and child had everything they needed. Biology might not make a father, but love and dedication did. And Jonah Creed, for all his gruff exterior and painful past, loved Samuel. She could see it in every gentle touch, every soft word, every moment he spent making sure the boy was safe and cared for. And she loved Jonah. The knowledge had been growing in her for weeks now, taking root like the spring flowers pushing up through the melting snow. She loved his quiet strength, his unexpected gentleness, the way he'd given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. She loved the way he talked to Samuel like the baby could understand every word, the way he hummed those tuneless lullabies when he thought no one was listening, the way he looked at her sometimes like she was something precious and surprising. But she hadn't told him. The words felt too big, too dangerous, especially with the threat of Vernon's arrival hanging over them. What if she told Jonah she loved him, and then her father came and tore them apart? What if she opened her heart completely, only to have it shattered when violence came to their mountain sanctuary? Better to wait. Better to hold the words close and safe until they knew what the future held. The days grew longer and warmer. Jonah began working outside more, repairing winter damage to the barn, checking the garden plot where he said he'd plant vegetables once the ground thawed completely, ranging farther on his trap lines now that the snow was retreating. Leela took to sitting on the porch with Samuel on warm afternoons, letting the baby feel the sun on his face while she mended or knitted or just breathed in the sweet mountain air. One afternoon in late March, she heard hoofbeats. Her body went rigid with fear, her hands automatically moving to gather Samuel close. But then she saw it was just Jonah returning from town. He'd made a trip down to trade furs for supplies and to gauge the mood in Dry Creek. His face when he dismounted told her everything she needed to know. "It's bad, isn't it?" she asked as he climbed the porch steps. "It's bad." Jonah sank down onto the bench beside her, suddenly looking exhausted. "Vernon's got people worked up. He's playing the grieving father, saying his daughter was stolen by a savage, that he paid me to give you shelter for the winter, and I took advantage. Some folks are starting to believe him, or at least they're not questioning him too loudly." "What about the people who saw him sell me?" Lila demanded. "Mrs. Patterson was there, Tom Brewster, the Reverend. They're keeping quiet, some out of fear, some because they don't want to go against Vernon Dale, some because they've convinced themselves they misunderstood what they saw." Jonah's jaw was tight with anger. "Cowards, the lot of them. But there's worse news. Vernon's organizing a party to ride up here. Soon as the main pass clears, another week, maybe 2, they're coming." The words landed like blows. A week or 2. That was all the time they had left. "How many men?" Lila asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Pike said at least 6, maybe more. Vernon's offering money to anyone who'll ride with him, and there's always men willing to take coin for violence." Jonah looked out at the mountains, his expression grim. "They'll be armed, they'll be angry, and they'll be expecting trouble." "Then we need to leave." The words tumbled out in a rush. "We can pack tonight, take what we can carry, head deeper into the mountains where they can't follow." "No." Jonah's voice was flat and final. "This is my home. I built this cabin with my own hands, buried my wife in the ground 100 yards from here. I'm not running from Vernon Dale or any man he brings with him." "But Jonah—" "I won't run, Lila." He turned to face her, and his eyes were blazing now. "All my life I've watched good people back down to bullies, watched weak men use money and influence to rewrite truth. I did it myself back in Dry Creek. Backed down, kept quiet, let things happen that shouldn't have happened. That's part of why I came up here. Why I told myself I'd never go back, but running away didn't make me a better man. It just made me a lonely one. You're not alone anymore, Lila said softly. You have us. Samuel and me, we need you alive, Jonah. What good is standing your ground if you're dead? Something flickered across his face. Pain, maybe, or fear he wouldn't admit to. I'm not planning on dying, but I'm not planning on running either. There's a middle ground, and we're going to find it. He reached over and gently touched Samuel's cheek, his finger tracing the baby's soft skin. I'll keep you both safe, I promise you that. But I'll do it here, in my home, on my terms. Lila wanted to argue more, wanted to make him see reason, but she could tell from the set of his jaw that his mind was made up. Jonah Creed was going to make his stand, and all she could do was stand beside him. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Jonah checked and rechecked his weapons, 2 rifles, a shotgun, and his revolver. He made sure their water barrels were full, their firewood stocked, their food supplies adequate for a siege if it came to that. He reinforced the cabin's shutters and made sure the doors would hold against a forced entry, and he taught Lila to shoot. I don't like guns, she protested, looking at the rifle he held out to her. You don't have to like them. You just have to know how to use them. Jonah's voice was patient but firm. If something happens to me, if I go down, you need to be able to protect yourself and Samuel. That means knowing which end the bullets come out of. So Lila learned. She learned how to load and aim and fire, how to work the rifle's action and judge the kick. She wasn't good at it. Her hands shook and her shots went wide more often than not. But by the end of the week, she could at least hit what she was aiming at if it was close enough and not moving. Jonah said that would have to be good enough. They were eating supper on a Tuesday evening when they heard it, the distant sound of hoofbeats and men's voices carrying across the still mountain air. Samuel was in his cradle, nearly asleep, and Lila felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. They're here, she whispered. Jonah was already moving, his face set in hard lines. Take Samuel into your room. Stay away from the windows. Don't come out unless I call for you. And if shooting starts, you get on the floor and stay there. You understand me? Jonah, do you understand? His voice was sharp with fear for her, and Lila nodded mutely. She scooped up Samuel, who woke and began to fuss, and hurried into the small room. She could hear Jonah moving around the cabin, the click of a rifle being loaded, the scrape of a chair being moved, his boots crossing to the door. Then his voice, loud enough to carry outside. That's far enough. State your business. Lila couldn't stay hidden. Moving as quietly as she could, she crept to the doorway and peered around the canvas curtain. Through the open door, she could see men on horseback. 6 of them, just as Jonah had predicted, their faces shadowed in the fading light. And at the front, sitting tall in his saddle like an avenging angel, was Vernon Dale. Her father looked older than she remembered, his face lined and his hair grayer, but his eyes were the same, hard and cold and righteous. He stared at the cabin like it was something that offended him, something that needed to be torn down and purified. Creed, Vernon said, his voice carrying the weight of assumed authority. I've come for my daughter. Step aside and there won't be trouble. Your daughter is here of her own free will, Jonah replied. His rifle was held loose but ready, and he stood in the doorway like a wall. You sold her to me last fall for $500 silver, or have you forgotten? I gave you coin to give her shelter, not to keep her prisoner. Vernon's voice rose, playing to the men behind him. You've held her here all winter, kept her isolated, God knows what else. That ends today. Lila! He raised his voice. Lila, if you're in there, come out. You're safe now. These men and I are here to take you home. Lila's hands tightened on Samuel, who was whimpering now, picking up on her fear. She wanted to call out, wanted to tell her father exactly what she thought of his lies, but Jonah caught her eye and gave a slight shake of his head. Not yet. She's not your property anymore, Vernon, Jonah said, his voice level but laced with steel. You gave up any claim to her when you sold her. She's staying here because this is her home now, her and the baby both. Baby? Vernon's face twisted. So the whore did drop her bastard. Is it even alive? White-hot rage flooded through Lila. Before she could think better of it, before Jonah could stop her, she was moving forward, stepping out from behind the curtain with Samuel in her arms. She crossed the cabin and came to stand beside Jonah, her chin raised defiantly. "Yes, Father, I had my baby. His name is Samuel, and he's alive and healthy and loved." Her voice was shaking but strong. "No thanks to you. You sold me, expecting me to die up here, hoping I'd die so you wouldn't have to face the shame of having a daughter who got pregnant outside of wedlock. But I didn't die. Jonah saved me. He helped me birth my son, gave us shelter and food and kindness when you gave us nothing but contempt." Vernon's face mottled with anger. "You ungrateful girl. After everything I did for you, everything I sacrificed. You sacrificed nothing." Lila's voice cracked like a whip. "You raised me after Mother died, yes, but you never loved me. You just tolerated me, and when I became an inconvenience, when my pregnancy threatened your precious reputation, you got rid of me. You sold me like you'd sell a horse or a cow, took silver coins for your own daughter, and now you have the nerve to come up here pretending to be the victim?" "She's been brainwashed," Vernon said to the men behind him. "You see? He's turned her against her own father. This is exactly what I was afraid of. Thompson, Willis, help me get her down from there." Two of the men started to dismount and Jonah's rifle came up fast. "I wouldn't do that if I were you. First man who sets foot on my porch gets a hole in him." The men froze, and suddenly the air was thick with tension. Lila could see the other riders shifting nervously, their hands moving toward their own weapons. Vernon's face was twisted with rage, and she realized with sickening clarity that her father had come here hoping for a fight. He wanted Jonah to resist, wanted a reason to paint him as the villain. If violence happened here tonight, Vernon would spin it as justified, as righteous men rescuing a captive woman from a mountain savage. "You're making a mistake, Creed," Vernon said, his voice icy. "These men are witnesses. They'll testify that you threatened us, that you refused to release my daughter." "I'll testify differently." Lila's voice rang out clear and strong. "I'll testify that you sold me, that Mr. Schneider counted out $500 silver in front of his store while half the town watched, that Mrs. Patterson saw it happen, and Tom Brewster, and Reverend Walsh, that you told Jonah I'd probably die in childbirth, and you didn't care as long as it happened far enough away that it wouldn't embarrass you." "You're lying," Vernon snarled. "You're a liar and a whore, just like I always said." "Careful." Jonah's voice dropped to something deadly quiet. "You don't talk to her that way. Not in front of me. Not ever." One of the other riders, a younger man Lila didn't recognize, spoke up hesitantly. "Mr. Dale, maybe we should just ask her directly. Let her say what she wants to do, and we can take her word for it." "She's been corrupted," Vernon snapped. "She doesn't know what she wants. We're here to save her from herself." "I know exactly what I want," Lila said. "I want to stay here. I want to raise my son in peace. I want you to leave us alone and never come back." Vernon's hand moved toward his coat, toward the gun Lila suddenly realized he was carrying, and everything seemed to slow down. She saw Jonah tense, saw his finger tighten on the rifle's trigger, saw the other men starting to react. Samuel was crying now, full-throated wails that cut through the mountain air, and Lila knew with terrible certainty that everything was about to go very, very wrong. "Don't," Jonah said, his voice hard as stone. "Don't draw that weapon, Vernon. There's been enough lies. Don't add killing to your list of sins." "You're the one who'll be doing the killing," Vernon said, but his hand stopped moving. "Threatening honest men who've come to rescue a captive woman. Is that what you told them?" Lila asked, looking at the other riders. "Did my father tell you I was being held prisoner? Did he tell you I was here against my will?" She turned to face them fully, Samuel still crying in her arms. "Look at me. Do I look like a prisoner? Do I look terrified, beaten, starved? Or do I look like a woman who's chosen to make a life in a place where she's treated with kindness and respect?" The youngest rider looked uncertain now, his eyes moving between Lila and Vernon. "I don't know, Mr. Dale. She seems pretty clear about wanting to stay." "She doesn't know what she wants," Vernon interrupted. "Now, all of you, I'm paying you to help me get my daughter back, and that's what we're going to do. Creed can either step aside or face the consequences." "Then I guess I face the consequences." Jonah's stance didn't waver. "Because I'm not letting you take her. Not unless she tells me herself that she wants to go with you, and I know she won't." For a long, terrible moment, No one moved. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting everything in shades of gold and crimson, and Lila thought absurdly that it was beautiful, that if violence came, it would happen in this beautiful light. Samuel's cries had quieted to hiccuping sobs, and she held him close, pressing her face against his soft hair. Then Vernon drew his gun. It happened fast and slow at the same time. Vernon's hand came up holding a revolver, and Jonah moved like lightning, diving to the side and firing his rifle in one smooth motion. The bullet caught Vernon in the shoulder and spun him halfway around in the saddle. The other men were shouting, some drawing their own weapons, some trying to control their spooked horses. Lila heard more gunfire, a rifle shot that splintered the doorframe inches from her head, the boom of a shotgun from somewhere off to the side. "Get inside!" Jonah roared, and Lila stumbled backward into the cabin, clutching Samuel to her chest. She tripped over the threshold and went down hard on her hip, pain shooting through her leg, but she kept her arms wrapped around the baby. Samuel was screaming now, terrified by the noise and confusion, and Lila crawled behind the heavy table, trying to put something solid between them and the bullets. Outside, the gunfight was in full fury. She could hear Jonah's rifle cracking, could hear men cursing and horses screaming. There was a tremendous crash, something hitting the porch, maybe a body, and then more shots, so many she couldn't count them. Her ears were ringing, and Samuel was crying so hard he could barely catch his breath, and Lila found herself praying to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Please don't let Jonah die. Please don't let Samuel be hurt. Please let this end. The shooting went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been, broken only by Samuel's ragged sobs and the sound of someone groaning in pain outside. "Lila," Jonah's voice, rough and strained. "You hurt?" "No." Her voice came out as a croak. "We're okay. Samuel's okay. Stay down. Don't come out yet." Lila heard footsteps on the porch, heard Jonah's voice again but couldn't make out the words. She stayed where she was, rocking Samuel and whispering soothing nonsense, her whole body shaking with reaction. Minutes crawled by. Finally, Jonah appeared in the doorway, and Lila gasped. He was bleeding. His left arm hung at an awkward angle, and there was blood soaking through his shirt from a wound high on his chest. But he was standing, was moving, and his eyes when they found her were fierce and alive. "It's over," he said. "Vernon's hit, 2 of his men are down, the rest ran. You're safe." Lila tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. Jonah crossed to her in 3 long strides and knelt beside her, his good arm going around her shoulders. She leaned into him, Samuel pressed between them, and felt tears streaming down her face. "I thought you were dead," she sobbed. "I thought he'd killed you." "Takes more than Vernon Dale and his hired guns to kill me." Jonah's voice was strained with pain, but there was a grim satisfaction in it too. "Let me look at you. You sure you're not hurt?" "I'm fine, but you're bleeding so much." "I'll live. Seen worse." He was checking her over anyway, his hand gentle despite its trembling, making sure she was truly unhurt. Then he looked down at Samuel, who had finally quieted to exhausted whimpers. "The boy?" "Just scared. He's not hurt." Lila touched Jonah's face, her fingers coming away sticky with someone else's blood. "You need a doctor." "Closest doctor is in Dry Creek, and I'm not going back there." Jonah stood slowly, wincing. "I've got supplies. You'll have to help me, though. My left arm's not working right." "Tell me what to do." So Lila, who had never tended a gunshot wound in her life, found herself following Jonah's terse instructions. She boiled water and found clean cloth. She helped him out of his ruined shirt and tried not to gasp at the ragged hole in his shoulder. The bullet had gone clean through, which Jonah said was good. It meant she wouldn't have to dig it out. She cleaned the wound as best she could while he gritted his teeth and bore it in silence. She bound it tight to stop the bleeding. And when she was done, Jonah was gray-faced and sweating, but still conscious. "You did good," he said through clenched teeth. "Real good." "What about—" Lila gestured toward the door, toward where Vernon and his men had been. She could still hear groaning from outside. "Vernon's alive. Bastard's got a shattered shoulder, but he'll live. I sent Thompson, he was the one who questioned your father. I sent him riding for the sheriff with a message. Told him to bring law up here, that there'd been a shooting and Vernon Dale started it. Don't know if he'll do it, but it's worth a try. And the others? 2 dead, Willis and a man named Garrett. They were the ones who kept shooting after I told them to stop. The rest ran when they realized they were going to die for Vernon's pride. Jonah's voice was hard. I didn't want to kill anyone, but they came to my home with guns and tried to take you by force. I won't apologize for defending what's mine. What's mine? The words hung in the air between them, fraught with meaning neither was quite ready to examine. Lila settled Samuel in his cradle. The baby had finally exhausted himself into sleep and came back to Jonah's side. Let me help you to the bed. You need to rest. Can't rest yet. Need to secure the scene, make sure those bodies don't draw predators. Jonah. Lila put her hand on his good arm, stopping him. You've lost blood. You've been shot. You're swaying on your feet. Let me help you to bed, and then I'll go out and do what needs doing. He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the exhaustion in his face, the pain he was trying to hide. You shouldn't have to. I can handle it. You taught me to be strong, remember? She managed a shaky smile. Now prove you trust me and let me take care of things. So Jonah, for once in his stubborn life, let someone else take charge. Lila helped him to his bed in the loft, the first time she'd been up there since arriving at the cabin, and got him settled with water and whiskey nearby. Then, with her heart in her throat and her hands still shaking, she went outside to face what the gunfight had left behind. Vernon was slumped against a tree where someone, probably Thompson, had dragged him. His shoulder was a mess of blood and torn cloth, and he looked smaller somehow, diminished. When he saw Lila, his eyes blazed with impotent fury. This isn't over, he rasped. I'll see him hanged for this. I'll see you both. You'll see nothing, Lila interrupted coldly. You came here with armed men. You drew first. You tried to take me against my will. Any judge with half a brain will see this for what it was. A man angry that his lies were exposed, trying to rewrite history with violence. No one will believe you. Thompson will. He heard me, heard you, heard everything, and he's writing for the sheriff right now. Lila crouched down so she was at eye level with her father. You wanted me gone because I embarrassed you. Well, I'm gone. I'm up here in the mountains with a good man who treats me better than you ever did, raising my son far away from your poison. You could have just let it be, but you couldn't stand that, could you? Couldn't stand that I might actually be happy, that I might have found something better than the life you gave me. Happy? Vernon spat the word. You're living in sin with a mountain savage, raising a bastard. I'm living, Lila said simply, and I'm loved. That's more than I ever had with you. She stood and walked away from him, her back straight despite how badly she wanted to collapse. The 2 dead men were sprawled in the dirt, and she forced herself to look at them, to see what violence looked like up close. Then she went to the barn and got a tarp to cover them. It wasn't much, but it was something. By the time she finished and went back inside, her hands were steady and her heart had stopped racing. She checked on Samuel, still sleeping, thank God, and then climbed the ladder to the loft. Jonah was awake, his eyes following her as she crossed to the bed. Is it done? It's done. Vernon's stable. The bodies are covered. Now you need to rest and heal. Lila. He reached out his good hand and she took it, sinking down to sit on the edge of the bed. What you did tonight, standing up to your father like that, it took courage, real courage. I learned it from you, she said softly. You taught me I was worth fighting for. They looked at each other in the lamplight, and Lila saw everything she'd been afraid to name written on Jonah's face, fear and relief, and something deeper, something that made her heart race for an entirely different reason than terror. When he drew that gun, Jonah said hoarsely, when I thought he might shoot you or the baby, I realized something. Realized I'd do anything, kill, die, burn the world down, to keep you safe. Both of you. Jonah, let me finish. His grip on her hand tightened. I told myself when you came here that I was just helping you, just giving you a place to have your baby. Told myself it was charity, or maybe a way to make up for failing Sarah. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being about that. You and Samuel, you became my family, my reason for getting up in the morning, my reason for everything. Lila felt tears spilling down her cheeks. I love you, she whispered. "I've been afraid to say it, afraid it was too soon or too complicated or too dangerous. But I love you, Jonah Creed. You saved my life in more ways than one, and I can't imagine being anywhere else but here with you." Jonah made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled her down into a kiss. It was gentle despite the passion behind it, his lips soft against hers, his good hand coming up to cup her face. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard, and Jonah was smiling, a real smile, wide and genuine and transforming his whole face. "I love you too," he said. "God help me, I do. And when this is over, when the law comes and we've settled things with Vernon, I want—" He stopped, suddenly uncertain. "If you'll have me? If you think Samuel could accept me as his father, I want to make this real. I want to marry you, Lila. Want to make you my wife proper, not just the woman sharing my cabin." "Yes," Lila said through her tears. "Yes, of course. Yes." They held each other as the night deepened around them, and outside Vernon Dale groaned and cursed and waited for a justice that was finally coming for him. The path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be questions, investigations, judgments passed. But Lila knew with bone-deep certainty that they would face it together, and that together they were strong enough to weather any storm. Dawn came cold and gray to the mountains, and with it came the sound of horses. Lila, who had dozed fitfully in a chair beside Jonah's bed, jerked awake at the first sound of hoofbeats and voices. Her hand went instinctively to the rifle leaning against the wall. Jonah had insisted she keep it close. And then she heard a voice calling out, "Creed, it's Sheriff Morrison. Thompson brought me up from Dry Creek. We're coming in peaceful. Don't shoot." Lila looked at Jonah, who had also woken at the sound. His face was pale and drawn with pain, but his eyes were alert. "Go down and let them in," he said quietly. "Time to face the music." She descended the ladder carefully, checked on Samuel, still miraculously asleep in his cradle, and went to the door. Outside, she could see at least 8 men on horseback, their breath steaming in the cold air. At the front was a thick-set man with a silver star pinned to his coat and eyes that had seen too much of human nature to be easily fooled. Behind him was Thompson, the young rider who had questioned Vernon the night before, looking exhausted and grim. "Ma'am," Sheriff Morrison said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Sheriff David Morrison out of Dry Creek. This is quite a situation we've got here. Mind if we come in and sort things out?" "Come in," Lila said, stepping aside. "But keep your voices down. My son is sleeping, and he's been through enough already." The sheriff dismounted and entered the cabin, followed by Thompson and 2 deputies. The others stayed outside, and Lila could hear them moving around, presumably examining the bodies and checking on Vernon. Morrison's eyes swept the cabin, taking in the signs of violence. Bullet holes in the doorframe, blood on the floor that Lila hadn't had time to clean, the general disarray of a home that had become a battlefield. "Where's Creed?" Morrison asked. "Upstairs. He was shot in the shoulder. I patched him up as best I could, but he needs a real doctor." Lila straightened her spine, meeting the sheriff's gaze directly. "Before you ask, I'll tell you what happened. My father came here last night with 6 armed men. He claimed he was here to rescue me, but that's a lie. I've been here since last fall by choice, after Vernon Dale sold me to Jonah Creed for $500 silver. My father drew his gun first. Jonah was defending his home and defending me." Morrison's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a claim, Miss Dale." "It's Mrs. Creed, actually," Lila said, the lie coming easily. "It would be true soon enough anyway." "And it's not a claim, Sheriff. It's the truth. There were witnesses to the sale. Half of Dry Creek saw it happen. Mrs. Patterson, Tom Brewster, Reverend Walsh, Mr. Schneider, who counted out the money. They all saw my father take silver coins in exchange for his daughter." "Thompson here told me something similar," Morrison said, glancing at the young man. "Said you were pretty clear about wanting to stay here, that Vernon Dale was the one pushing for violence." "That's right, sir," Thompson spoke up. His face was earnest, and his eyes, when they met Lila's, were apologetic. "Mr. Dale hired us, said his daughter was being held prisoner by a mountain man, but when we got here, she came right out and said she was staying by choice. Said her father had sold her and she wanted nothing to do with him. Mr. Dale didn't like that. He drew his gun on Creed, and Creed shot him. Then Willis and Garrett started shooting, and—" he swallowed hard. It was chaos, sir. But Creed was defending himself. I saw it. One of the deputies had climbed the ladder to the loft, and now he called down. Sheriff, you better come see this. Man up here is in bad shape. Morrison climbed up, and Lila heard low voices. Jonah's rough with pain, the sheriff's measured and careful. After a few minutes, Morrison came back down, his expression thoughtful. Creed's story matches yours, he said to Lila. He says Vernon Dale sold you last fall, that he gave you shelter through the winter, helped you birth your baby, says he never touched you except to help you, that you've been here of your own free will the whole time. Because it's true, Lila said firmly. Every word of it. Then why's Vernon been telling everyone in town that his daughter was stolen? Why's he been playing the grieving father all winter, organizing a rescue party? Morrison's eyes were sharp. Man doesn't do that unless he believes it, or unless he's got something to gain from the lie. He has everything to gain, Lila said bitterly. Vernon Dale's reputation is everything to him. Having a daughter who got pregnant outside of wedlock, who had to be sold off to avoid embarrassing him, that would have destroyed his standing in Dry Creek. But if I was stolen, if I was held prisoner by a savage mountain man, then he's the victim. His shame becomes tragedy, and no one questions him. Morrison was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then he said, I'm going to need to talk to those witnesses you mentioned. If what you're saying is true, if there were people who saw the sale happen, they'll have to testify to it. They saw it, Lila said. Whether they'll admit to it now is another question. My father has money and influence. The people of Dry Creek don't like going against him. We'll see about that. Morrison turned to his deputies. Carter, ride back down and bring up Mrs. Patterson, Tom Brewster, and Reverend Walsh. Tell them the sheriff needs them to answer some questions under oath. And find Mr. Schneider, too. If money changed hands in his store, he'll remember it. The deputy nodded and headed out. Morrison settled into a chair at the table, and Lila found herself being questioned in detail about everything that had happened since last fall. She told him about Billy Henderson's abandonment, about her father's rage and shame, about standing in front of Schneider's store while Vernon sold her like cattle. She told him about the long walk up the mountain, about Jonah's unexpected kindness, about Samuel's birth in the middle of a blizzard. She told him about Pike, the trader bringing news of Vernon's lies, about the long winter spent dreading this moment. And then she told him about the previous night, about Vernon's arrival with his hired guns, about the confrontation on the porch, about her father drawing his weapon first. I was holding my baby, Lila said, and her voice shook despite her efforts to control it. My 4-month-old son, and my father pointed a gun at us. If Jonah hadn't fired first, if he hadn't been faster, I think Vernon would have killed him. Maybe would have killed me too if I'd tried to testify against him. Morrison's face was grim. That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Creed. It's a serious truth, Sheriff. Lila met his eyes steadily. My father cares more about his reputation than he ever cared about me. I stopped being his daughter the moment I became a liability. Samuel chose that moment to wake up, his cries cutting through the tension in the cabin. Lila excused herself and went to tend to him, grateful for a moment to compose herself. She nursed the baby in the small room behind the canvas curtain, her hands shaking slightly as the weight of everything that had happened finally began to sink in. 2 men were dead. Jonah was wounded. Her father was outside under guard, and the law had finally come to sort through the wreckage of Vernon Dale's pride and lies. When she emerged, Morrison was at the base of the ladder, speaking quietly with someone up in the loft. After a moment, the sheriff came back down, his expression troubled. Creed's in bad shape, he said. I'm sending one of my men back for Doc Fletcher. Man needs proper medical attention, and he needs it soon. Thank you, Lila said quietly. Don't thank me yet. The situation is messy as hell, pardon my language. 2 men dead, Vernon Dale shot and screaming about attempted murder, you claiming he sold you, him claiming you were stolen. Morrison shook his head, going to take more than Thompson's word to sort this out. Need those witnesses to come forward. They will, Lila said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. They have to. But when the witnesses arrived several hours later, brought up the mountain by Deputy Carter, Lila's confidence wavered. Mrs. Patterson looked terrified, her eyes darting around like she expected to be attacked at any moment. Tom Brewster's face was carefully neutral, revealing nothing. Reverend Walsh clutched his Bible and wouldn't meet Lila's gaze. And Mr. Schneider, the storekeeper, looked deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation. Morrison questioned them one at a time, first together in the cabin and then separately outside. Lila couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see the body language. Mrs. Patterson wringing her hands, Tom Brewster's arms crossed defensively, Reverend Walsh shaking his head. After nearly an hour, Morrison came back inside, and the look on his face made Lila's stomach drop. "Well?" she asked. "Mrs. Patterson says she doesn't remember clearly what happened that morning. Says it might have been a sale or might have been Creed agreeing to give you shelter in exchange for money. She's not sure. Tom Brewster says he was too far away to hear the specific words exchanged. Reverend Walsh says he arrived late and only saw the end of the transaction." Morrison's voice was flat. "Schneider admits money changed hands in front of his store, but he says he can't recall the exact amount or what was said. Says it's been months and he does a lot of business." "They're lying," Lila said, anger rising hot in her chest. "They're protecting my father because they're afraid of him, because going against Vernon Dale means making an enemy of the most powerful man in Dry Creek. But they saw it happen, Sheriff, all of them. They stood there and watched my father sell me, and they did nothing to stop it." "What they saw and what they'll testify to are two different things," Morrison said heavily. "Without their testimony, it's your word and Creed's against Vernon's, and Vernon's got 2 dead men and a shattered shoulder on his side." "He drew first," Lila insisted. "Thompson saw it. Thompson's word helps, but he's young, and he was one of the men Vernon hired. Defense attorney would tear him apart, say he's trying to avoid responsibility for the deaths himself." Morrison sat down heavily. "I believe you, Mrs. Creed. For what it's worth, I think you're telling the truth. But belief isn't proof, and the law needs proof." Lila felt despair washing over her. After everything, after surviving the winter and building a life and defending their home, they were going to lose because the good people of Dry Creek were too cowardly to speak the truth. She sank into a chair, Samuel heavy in her arms, and fought back tears of frustration. Then she heard a commotion outside. Voices raised in anger, the sound of someone shouting. Morrison went to the door and Lila followed, curious despite her despair. Vernon was conscious now, propped against the tree where they'd left him the night before. His face was twisted with pain and rage, and he was yelling at someone, one of Morrison's deputies it looked like, demanding to be taken back to town, demanding that Jonah be arrested immediately, demanding justice for his wounded shoulder and his dead men. "You'll get your justice," Morrison called out. "But first we're going to get to the bottom of what happened here." "The bottom?" Vernon's laugh was ugly. "The bottom is that Mountain Savage tried to kill me and did kill 2 good men. Arrest him, Morrison. Do your job." "I'm doing my job," Morrison said evenly. "Which includes hearing all sides of the story. Your daughter says you sold her last fall, says there were witnesses, says you drew your weapon first last night." "My daughter is a liar and a whore," Vernon spat. "She's been living in sin with that animal for months. God knows what he's done to her, what threats he's made. You can't trust a word she says." Something in Lila snapped. She'd been called a whore before, had endured that particular insult from her father and from the gossips in town. But hearing it now, in front of the sheriff and the witnesses and God and everybody, while she stood on the porch of the home she'd made with a man who actually loved her, it was too much. "Don't you dare," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "Don't you dare call me those names when you're the one who sold me. When you took $500 silver and handed me over to a stranger like I was livestock. When you told him I'd probably die in childbirth and you didn't care as long as it happened far enough away that you wouldn't have to bury me where people could see." Vernon's face went an ugly shade of purple. "You ungrateful! Ungrateful!" Lila descended the porch steps, fury making her bold. "What exactly should I be grateful for, Father? For raising me after Mother died? You did that out of obligation, not love. For selling me when I became inconvenient? For coming up here with armed men to drag me back so you could finish what you started and make sure I was properly dead and buried this time?" "I was trying to save you," Vernon snarled. "Trying to bring you home." "Liar!" The word cut through the mountain air like a blade. "You've never wanted to save me. You wanted to save your reputation. That's all you've ever cared about. What people think of Vernon Dale, how they talk about you at church, whether your precious standing in the community might be affected by having a daughter who made a mistake. Well, I'm done caring what you think, and I'm done pretending you were ever anything but a cruel, selfish man who loved his pride more than his own child. Silence fell over the clearing. Even Vernon seemed shocked into speechlessness by Lila's outburst. Mrs. Patterson had her hand pressed to her mouth, and there were tears in her eyes. Tom Brewster was staring at the ground. Reverend Walsh looked like he'd been slapped. She's right. The voice came from an unexpected source. Mr. Schneider, the storekeeper, stepping forward with his hands clenched at his sides. God help me. She's right. I counted out 500 silver dollars that morning, Vernon. I watched you take that money, and I watched you hand your daughter over to Jonah Creed like she was a horse you were selling. And when he rode out of town with her, you went straight to the saloon and bought drinks for everyone, celebrating that you'd gotten rid of your problem. Vernon's face went from purple to white. Schneider, you keep your mouth shut. No. Schneider's voice was shaking, but he didn't back down. I've kept my mouth shut for months, listening to you tell your lies about how your daughter was stolen. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't get involved. But 2 men are dead now, and Jonah Creed is up there wounded, and that girl, he gestured to Lila, that girl's been through hell because you couldn't stand to face the consequences of your own cruelty. I won't be part of it anymore. Sheriff, I'll testify. I'll swear under oath that Vernon Dale sold his daughter for 500 silver dollars, that it was a sale, not a charitable arrangement, and that everyone in that street that morning knew exactly what was happening. You're a dead man, Schneider, Vernon hissed. I'll ruin you. I'll make sure you never do business in this territory again. Then I'll do business somewhere else, Schneider said quietly. Some things are worth more than money, Vernon. I should have remembered that back in October. I'm remembering it now. There was a long pause, and then Mrs. Patterson spoke up, her voice trembling. I saw it too. I saw Vernon take the money, and I heard him say, she swallowed hard, I heard him say, take her, and whatever shame she's carrying, I won't have a bastard child bearing my name. I told myself later that I must have misheard, that a man wouldn't say that about his own daughter, but I heard it. God forgive me, I heard it, and I said nothing. I was there too, Tom Brewster added, his face flushed with shame. I heard the whole thing, heard Vernon negotiate the price, heard him say he wanted her gone. I should have spoken up, should have said something, but Vernon Dale is a powerful man, and I'm just a blacksmith. I was afraid. Reverend Walsh was the last to speak, and his voice was heavy with guilt. I arrived as the transaction was concluding. I saw money change hands, and I saw Vernon walk away without a backward glance at his daughter. I told myself it was a private family matter, that it wasn't my place to interfere, but a man of God should stand for truth, and I failed in that duty. I will testify, Sheriff. I will tell what I saw. Vernon was breathing hard, his good hand clenched into a fist, his eyes wild with impotent fury. The carefully constructed story he'd spent all winter building was crumbling around him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His witnesses, the people he'd counted on to be too afraid or too complicit to speak against him, were turning on him one by one, and the truth was finally, inexorably, coming to light. Morrison looked from the witnesses to Vernon and back again. Seems like things are getting clearer, he said dryly. Mr. Dale, I'm going to have to ask you to come back to Dry Creek with us. There'll be a hearing to determine what happened here, and it's starting to look like you've got a lot to answer for. This is ridiculous, Vernon spat. I'm the victim here. I was shot. You were shot after you drew your weapon on a man defending his home, Morrison interrupted. And according to multiple witnesses, you came here under false pretenses, claiming to rescue a daughter you'd actually sold months ago. That's fraud, Mr. Dale. And the deaths of Willis and Garrett, if you organized this raid based on lies, if you got those men killed because you were trying to cover up your own actions, that could be seen as manslaughter. Maybe worse. You can't prove any of that, Vernon said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Maybe not, but I've got enough to hold you while we investigate. Morrison turned to his deputies. Get him on a horse, carefully. Man's hurt bad. And someone ride ahead for Doc Fletcher. We'll need him to look at Dale's shoulder and then get up here to see to Creed. As the deputies moved to comply, Vernon's eyes found Lila's. For a moment, she saw something in them that might have been regret, or might have been just the pain from his shattered shoulder. But then his face hardened into familiar contempt. "You've destroyed me," he said flatly. "My own daughter, destroying me." "No," Lila said quietly. "You destroyed yourself. I just stopped lying to protect you." They took Vernon away, loading him onto a horse despite his groans of pain. The witnesses went with them, subdued and ashamed, and Morrison's deputies carried the two dead men wrapped in tarps. Thompson lingered behind, approaching Lila hesitantly. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm sorry. Sorry I was part of this. Sorry I almost helped him take you. I should have questioned things more, should have trusted what I saw instead of what I was told." "You came back?" Lila said simply. "You rode for the sheriff when you could have just gone home. That took courage." "Not enough courage," Thompson said. "Not as much as you showed, but I'll testify at the hearing. I'll make sure everyone knows what really happened." "Thank you." Thompson rode away, and suddenly the clearing was quiet. Lila stood on the porch, Samuel in her arms, and looked out at the mountains. The sun was climbing higher now, burning off the morning mist, and the world looked scrubbed clean by the night's violence. She felt hollowed out, exhausted, but there was also a strange sense of lightness. The truth was out. Vernon's lies had been exposed. And for the first time since Billy Henderson had abandoned her, Lila felt like she could breathe without the weight of shame pressing down on her chest. "Lila?" Jonah's voice came weakly from the loft. "What happened? I heard shouting." She went up the ladder, moving carefully with Samuel in one arm, and found Jonah trying to sit up. "Lie down," she ordered. "You'll open your wound." "Tell me what happened," he insisted, but he did lie back, his face gray with pain. So Lila told him everything, about Morrison's arrival, about the witnesses' initial reluctance, about her confrontation with Vernon, and about how Schneider and the others had finally found the courage to speak the truth. Jonah listened in silence, his good hand finding hers and gripping tight. "It's over then," he said when she finished. "The truth is out." "It's out," Lila agreed. "But I don't know what happens next." "There'll be a hearing," Morrison said. "Testimony, questions." "And we'll answer them," Jonah said firmly. "Together. No more hiding, no more shame. We'll tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may." Samuel began to fuss, and Lila shifted him to her other arm. "You should rest. The doctor is coming." "In a minute." Jonah's eyes were intense on her face. "What you said down there to your father, I heard some of it through the window. You were magnificent, Lila. Fierce and strong and so damn brave." "I was terrified," Lila admitted, "but I was also angry. Angry that he thought he could keep lying, that he could keep treating me like I was nothing. And I realized something. I'm not nothing. I'm a mother. I'm a survivor. And I'm loved. That makes me worth more than Vernondale's reputation will ever be." "You are," Jonah said hoarsely. "You're worth everything." He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "When I'm healed, when this is all settled, I'm going to marry you proper, going to make you my wife in front of God and everybody, so no one can ever question that you belong here with me." "I already belong here," Lila said softly. "But I'll marry you anyway," Jonah creed. "I'll marry you and be proud to call myself your wife." They stayed like that, hands clasped, Samuel dozing between them, until the sound of hoofbeats announced Doc Fletcher's arrival. The doctor was an elderly man with kind eyes and gentle hands, and he clucked disapprovingly over Jonah's wound. "Whoever patched you up did a decent job," he said, examining Lila's handiwork. "But you need stitches, and you need to stay still for at least a week. That shoulder's going to take time to heal, and if you push it too hard, you could do permanent damage." "I'll make sure he stays still," Lila promised. Doc Fletcher smiled at her. "I'm sure you will. You're Vernondale's daughter, aren't you?" "I was," Lila said carefully. "I'm Jonah Creed's wife now." "Good for you," the doctor said, surprising her. "Vernondale is a hard man, always has been. Rigid and proud and convinced he's always right. I've seen him break other people to fit his view of how the world should be. Glad to see someone finally stood up to him." While the doctor worked on Jonah, cleaning the wound more thoroughly, stitching it closed with neat, precise movements, Lila went downstairs and tried to restore some order to the cabin. She cleaned up the blood, swept the floor, started a pot of stew for dinner. Normal, domestic tasks that felt surreal after the violence of the previous night. Samuel played on his blanket, grabbing at his toes and making happy sounds, blissfully unaware of how close he'd come to losing everything. The days that followed were strange and quiet. Jonah was confined to bed by doctor's orders, frustrated and restless but healing. Lila took over all the outdoor chores, feeding the animals, hauling water, gathering eggs. It was hard work, especially with a baby to care for, but she found she didn't mind. There was something satisfying about proving to herself that she could do it, that she was capable and strong. A week after the shooting, Deputy Carter rode up with news. The hearing had been scheduled for the following month, once Jonah was well enough to travel down to Dry Creek. Vernon had been released from custody. His shoulder was too badly damaged for him to be kept in a cell. But he was under orders not to leave town, and the talk in Dry Creek, Carter said, was all about Vernon Dale's fall from grace. People are turning on him, Carter explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Lila. Once Schneider and the others started talking, once the story got out about how he really treated his daughter, folks started remembering other things. Other people Vernon had wronged, other times he'd used his money and influence to get his way. It's like a dam broke, and now everyone's speaking up. What's he saying? Lila asked. Vernon, I mean. How's he defending himself? He's not, really. He's holed up in his house, seeing no one. His friends have started avoiding him, and people cross the street when they see him coming. He's become a pariah practically overnight. Carter shook his head. Hard fall for a man who used to run that town. After Carter left, Lila climbed up to tell Jonah the news. He was sitting up in bed now, his arms still in a sling but looking stronger every day. Good, he said when she finished. Let him see how it feels to be shunned, to have everyone turn their backs. Let him understand what he put you through. I almost feel sorry for him, Lila admitted. Almost. Then I remember how he looked at me that day in front of the store, like I was something disgusting he needed to scrape off his boot, and the sympathy dies. You've got a good heart, Jonah said. Too good for Vernon Dale. But don't waste your pity on him, Lila. He made his choices, and now he's living with them. As the weeks passed and spring truly took hold in the mountains, life began to feel almost normal again. Jonah healed slowly but surely, regaining strength and movement in his injured arm. Samuel grew and changed daily, developing a personality that was equal parts sweet and stubborn. And Lila found herself settling into a contentment she'd never known before. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Jonah pulled something from his pocket. It was a small carved box, smooth and beautiful, with a wolf and a doe etched into the lid. Made this for you, he said gruffly, handing it to her. While I was stuck in bed going crazy from boredom. Lila opened the box and gasped. Inside was a ring, simple, carved from wood, but exquisitely made. It was sized to fit her finger, and when she slipped it on, it sat perfectly, like it had been made just for her. Which, of course, it had. Jonah, she breathed, it's beautiful. It's not gold, he said quickly, not even silver. But when we go down for the hearing, when we're in front of the judge and the witnesses and everyone, I want you to have a ring. Want everyone to see that you're my wife, that you chose me. I did choose you, Lila said, tears pricking her eyes. I choose you every day, Jonah Creed. And this ring... She held up her hand, admiring the way the firelight caught on the smooth wood. This ring is worth more than gold to me, because you made it with your own hands, and you made it with love. He pulled her close with his good arm, and she settled against his chest, careful of his healing shoulder. Samuel was asleep in his cradle, and the fire crackled softly, and outside the spring night was full of the sound of running water and returning birds. We're going to be all right, Jonah said quietly. The hearing, the town, Vernon, none of it matters as long as we have this. As long as we have each other. We're going to be more than all right, Lila corrected. We're going to be happy. And sitting there in the warm cabin with the man she loved and the child she'd fought so hard to bring into the world, Lila knew it was true. The path ahead might still have challenges. There was still the hearing to face, still questions to answer, still a community's judgment to endure. But she'd survived worse. They both had. And whatever came next, they would face it together. And together they were strong enough for anything. The wooden ring on her finger caught the firelight, and Lila smiled. It was a promise, that ring. A promise of forever, of home, of a love that had been born from tragedy but had grown into something beautiful and enduring. Vernon Dale had tried to destroy her, had sold her away like garbage, had expected her to die forgotten in the mountains. Instead, she'd found life. She'd found love. She'd found everything she'd never known she needed. And soon, when they went down to Dry Creek for the hearing, she would stand before the town that had rejected her and show them what she'd become. Not the fat, shameful daughter of Vernon Dale. Not a burden or a disgrace. But Lila Creed, mother, wife, survivor. A woman who had been broken and had made herself whole again, who had been sold and had found her true worth, who had been sentenced to die and had chosen to live instead. Let them see her now. Let them see what their silence had helped create. Not a victim, but a victor. And let Vernon Dale look at what he'd thrown away and know, finally and forever, that his greatest mistake wasn't having a daughter who made him ashamed. It was being too blind and too proud to see that his daughter was worth loving all along. The morning they left for Dry Creek, the mountains were painted in shades of gold and green, spring having fully claimed the high country. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and the air smelled of pine and fresh growth and possibility. Lila stood on the porch with Samuel in her arms, looking out at the valley below, and felt her stomach twist with nervousness. "We don't have to go," Jonah said quietly from beside her. His arm was still tender but healing well, and he'd been practicing his strength by chopping wood and working around the cabin. "We could send word that we're not coming, that we'll face whatever consequences they want to hand down without setting foot in that town again." "No," Lila said firmly. "I want to go. I need to go. I need to stand in front of everyone and tell the truth. Need to look Vernon in the eye one more time and show him that he didn't break me." She turned to Jonah, her chin raised. "And I want to marry you there, in the church where I was baptized. Want everyone to see that I chose you, that we're a family." Jonah's expression softened. "All right then. We go together, we face them together, and we come home together, as husband and wife." They'd packed light, just enough supplies for a few days in town, a change of clothes, and Samuel's necessities. Jonah had brought the wagon down from where he'd stored it for winter, and he'd fashioned a nest of blankets in the back where Lila could ride with the baby. The journey would take most of the day, and they wanted to arrive before dark. As they descended the mountain road, Lila found herself remembering the last time she'd made this journey, pregnant, terrified, sold like livestock to a stranger she'd been told was a monster. How different everything was now. She sat in the wagon with her son in her arms and the man she loved at the reins, and instead of fear, she felt determination. Let Dry Creek see what Vernon Dale's cruelty had created. Let them see that his attempt to destroy his daughter had instead freed her to become someone stronger. They stopped at midday beside the same stream where they'd rested on that first journey. Jonah helped Lila down from the wagon, and she nursed Samuel while Jonah watered the horses. The baby was getting big now, solid and healthy, with chubby cheeks and bright eyes that tracked everything with intense interest. He'd started reaching for things, started making sounds that were almost words, and Lila felt a fierce surge of love every time she looked at him. "You thinking about that first day?" Jonah asked, settling beside her on a sun-warmed rock. "I was," Lila admitted, "thinking about how scared I was, how certain I was that I was going to die up in those mountains, that Vernon had sent me away to die. And instead you lived." Jonah reached over and gently touched Samuel's downy hair. "You both lived, thrived even." "Because of you," Lila said softly. "You saved us, Jonah. In every way a person can be saved." "We saved each other," he corrected. "I was dying up there too, just in a different way. Dying of loneliness and grief and believing I didn't deserve a second chance. Then you came along with your strength and your stubbornness and your refusal to give up, and you reminded me what it felt like to be alive." They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the water burble over stones and the wind sigh through the pines. Then Jonah stood and held out his hand. "Ready to face the wolves?" Lila took his hand and let him help her up, Samuel secure against her shoulder. "As ready as I'll ever be." They reached Dry Creek as the sun was setting, painting the dusty main street in shades of amber and rose. The town looked smaller than Lila remembered, shabbier somehow, and she realized with surprise that she didn't miss it at all. This place that had been her whole world for most of her life now felt foreign and unwelcoming, and she was grateful she'd be leaving again in a few days. People stopped and stared as the wagon rolled past. Lila saw Mrs. Patterson standing in the doorway of the general store, her hand pressed to her mouth. She saw Tom Brewster at his forge, his hammer frozen mid-swing. She saw Reverend Walsh coming out of the church, his Bible clutched to his chest. And she saw the way they all looked at her, with curiosity, with shame, with something that might have been respect. Jonah drove straight to the boarding house at the edge of town. Mrs. Chen, the elderly Chinese woman who ran it, came out onto the porch and bowed slightly. "Mr. Creed," she said in her precise, accented English, "and this must be your wife. Sheriff Morrison said you'd be coming. I have a room ready for you." "Thank you, Mrs. Chen," Jonah said, helping Lila down from the wagon. "We appreciate your hospitality." The room was small but clean, with a real bed and a wash basin and a window that looked out at the mountains. Lila settled Samuel on the bed while Jonah brought in their bags, and for a moment she just stood there, feeling displaced and uncomfortable in this in-between space that was neither her father's house nor Jonah's cabin. "It's just for a few days," Jonah said, reading her thoughts. "Then we go home." "Home," Lila repeated, and the word tasted like honey on her tongue. Home wasn't Dry Creek. Home was a cabin in the mountains with a man who loved her and a life she'd built from the wreckage of her father's cruelty. That evening, they ate dinner in the boarding house's small dining room. A few other guests stared openly at them, and Lila heard whispers, words like Vernondale's daughter and the mountain man and "Can you believe it?" She kept her head high and her hand in Jonah's, and she fed Samuel and ignored the gossip floating around her like smoke. After dinner, Sheriff Morrison stopped by with news about the hearing. "It's set for tomorrow afternoon at the courthouse," he said, sitting at their table with his hat in his hands. "Judge Whitmore is presiding. He's fair but tough, won't stand for nonsense from either side. Vernon will be there with his lawyer, a man named Hartwell who came up from Denver. You'll have a chance to tell your story, and so will the witnesses." "What about charges?" Jonah asked. "Am I going to be arrested for killing those men?" Morrison shook his head. "Self-defense, based on everything I've heard. You were protecting your home and your family from armed intruders. Thompson's testimony backs that up, and so do the witnesses. Vernon's the one in trouble. Fraud, conspiracy, possibly manslaughter for getting Willis and Garrett killed. Hartwell's trying to negotiate a settlement, but the judge wants to hear the full story before he makes any decisions." "Good," Lila said firmly. "Let everyone hear it. Let them know the truth." Morrison studied her with something like approval. "You've changed since the last time I saw you, Mrs. Creed. Gotten stronger." "I had to," Lila said simply. "It was that or die." After the sheriff left, Lila nursed Samuel and got him ready for bed. The baby was fussy in the unfamiliar room, unsettled by the strange sounds and smells, and it took a long time to get him to sleep. Jonah paced by the window, his tension obvious in every line of his body. "What if it goes wrong?" he finally asked. "What if the judge believes Vernon or decides that I used excessive force or—" "Then we'll deal with it," Lila interrupted. "But it won't go wrong, Jonah. The truth is on our side, the witnesses are on our side, and I'll be there telling everyone exactly what Vernon Dale is. A cruel, selfish man who cared more about his reputation than his own daughter's life." Jonah came to her then, pulling her into his arms carefully, mindful of Samuel sleeping between them. "I love you," he said roughly. "No matter what happens tomorrow, I want you to know that. I love you, and I'm grateful for every day I've had with you." "I love you too," Lila whispered against his chest. "And we're going to have a lifetime of days together, you'll see." The courthouse was packed the next afternoon. It seemed like everyone in Dry Creek had turned out to witness Vernon Dale's reckoning, and Lila could feel the weight of their stares as she and Jonah made their way to the front. She dressed carefully that morning in her best dress, the one Jonah had bought from Pike the trader back in January, and she carried Samuel against her hip with confidence. The wooden ring Jonah had carved sat on her finger, visible to anyone who looked. Vernon was already seated at a table with his lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit. Vernon's arm was still in a sling, and his face was haggard, but his eyes burned with undiminished hatred when they landed on Lila. She met his gaze steadily, and didn't look away until he did. Judge Whitmore was an imposing figure with iron gray hair and a face that suggested he'd seen every kind of human foolishness and wasn't impressed by any of it. He called the hearing to order with a bang of his gavel, and the crowd quieted immediately. This is a hearing to determine the facts surrounding the events of March 29th at the mountain residence of Jonah Creed, the judge said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room. We're here to establish what happened, who bears responsibility, and what consequences, if any, should follow. Mr. Hartwell, you're representing Mr. Vernon Dale? I am, Your Honor, Hartwell said, standing smoothly. And I'd like to begin by stating that my client is the victim in this situation. He went to retrieve his daughter from a dangerous man who had taken advantage of her vulnerable state, and he was shot for his efforts. 2 of his companions were killed. Mr. Dale has suffered greatly, both physically and emotionally, and he deserves justice. Duly noted, Judge Whitmore said dryly. Sheriff Morrison, present your findings. Morrison stood and methodically laid out everything he'd learned, about the sale in front of Schneider's store, about Lila's stay in the mountain cabin, about Vernon's winter-long campaign of lies, about the confrontation that had ended in gunfire. He read from his notes, citing witness statements and Thompson's account, and by the time he finished, Vernon's face had gone pale. Your Honor, Hartwell said quickly, my client disputes this characterization of events. The money that changed hands was payment for Mr. Creed to provide temporary shelter for Miss Dale, not a sale. Mr. Dale had every right to check on his daughter's well-being, and when he arrived and found her apparently held against her will, I was not held against my will, Lila said loudly, standing up. Your Honor, may I speak? Judge Whitmore's eyebrows rose. You're Mrs. Creed, I presume. I am, or I will be officially, as soon as this hearing is over and Reverend Walsh agrees to marry us properly. Lila took a deep breath. Your Honor, everything Sheriff Morrison said is true. My father sold me last October for $500 silver. He did it because I was pregnant and unmarried, because I embarrassed him, because he valued his reputation more than my life. He told Jonah Creed that I'd probably die in childbirth, and he didn't care as long as it happened far away where no one could see. That's a lie, Vernon snarled, half rising from his chair. Your Honor, my daughter is clearly confused. Sit down, Mr. Dale, Judge Whitmore said sharply. You'll have your chance to speak. Continue, Mrs. Creed. So Lila continued. She told the whole story. The shame and fear after Billy Henderson abandoned her, her father's rage and disgust, the morning she was sold in front of half the town. She told about the long walk up the mountain, about her terror of the man she'd been told was a monster. She told about Samuel's birth in the middle of a blizzard, about Jonah's gentle care, about the winter they'd spent building a life together. And she told about Vernon's arrival with armed men, about his refusal to believe that she'd chosen to stay, about the moment he'd drawn his gun. My father didn't come to rescue me, Your Honor, Lila said, her voice ringing clear. He came to eliminate the evidence of his cruelty. As long as I was alive and could testify about what he'd done, his reputation was at risk. But if I died, if Jonah Creed died, then Vernon Dale could go back to being the upstanding citizen everyone thought he was. The deaths of Willis and Garrett are on his hands, not Jonah's. Jonah was defending his home from armed intruders. He was defending me and our son. And I will swear on any Bible you put in front of me that every word I've said is the absolute truth. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel for silence, then turned to Vernon's lawyer. Mr. Hartwell, does your client wish to respond to these allegations? Hartwell conferred with Vernon in low, urgent whispers. Then he stood, his smooth confidence visibly shaken. Your Honor, my client maintains that this was a misunderstanding, that— I'd like to hear from Mr. Dale himself, Judge Whitmore interrupted. Mr. Dale, stand up and tell me, did you sell your daughter last October for $500 silver? Vernon stood slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Your Honor, what I did was arrange for temporary care for my daughter in her time of need. I paid Mr. Creed to top— Did you sell her? Yes or no? The judge's voice cracked like a whip. The silence stretched out, heavy and damning. Finally, Vernon said, I gave her to him. She was an embarrassment, a stain on my family's name. She needed to be gone. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock throughout the courtroom. Hartwell looked like he wanted to sink through the floor, and Lila felt a strange sense of relief. Finally, Vernon had admitted the truth. Judge Whitmore's face was granite. "Mr. Schneider, you're listed as a witness. Stand and be sworn in." Mr. Schneider stood, raised his hand, and swore to tell the truth. Then, in a shaking but steady voice, he confirmed everything Lila had said. He described counting out the $500, described Vernon's words about being rid of his shame, described the way Vernon had celebrated afterward at the saloon. "Did Miss Dale appear to go willingly?" Judge Whitmore asked. "No, Your Honor. She looked terrified. But she went because she had no choice. Her father was selling her, and everyone knew it." Mrs. Patterson testified next, her voice thick with shame and tears. She confirmed Schneider's account, adding details about Lila's appearance, the fear in her eyes, the way she'd tried to plead with her father, the absolute defeat in her posture as she'd followed Jonah out of town. "Did you speak up?" Judge Whitmore asked. "Did you attempt to intervene?" "No, Your Honor." Mrs. Patterson was openly crying now. "I told myself it wasn't my place, that it was a family matter, but I should have said something, should have done something. I've regretted it every day since." Tom Brewster and Reverend Walsh gave similar testimony, their voices heavy with guilt. Thompson spoke about the confrontation at the cabin, about how clear Lila had been about wanting to stay, about Vernon's rage and his decision to draw his weapon. By the time all the witnesses had spoken, the picture was undeniable. Vernon Dale had sold his daughter, lied about it for months, and gotten 2 men killed trying to cover up his actions. "Mr. Dale," Judge Whitmore said, his voice cold with contempt, "you are a disgrace. You sold your own daughter like chattel. You lied to your community, and you organized an armed raid that resulted in 2 deaths. I find you guilty of fraud, conspiracy, and criminal negligence leading to manslaughter. You will pay restitution to the families of Willis and Garrett. You will pay a fine of $1,000 to the territorial court, and you will serve 6 months in the territorial prison. Furthermore, all property and assets will be frozen until you've satisfied these obligations." Vernon's face went white, then red. "You can't, this is—" "Bailiff, remove Mr. Dale from my courtroom," Judge Whitmore said. "I've heard enough." As Vernon was led away, still protesting, still refusing to accept the consequences of his actions, Lila felt something loosen in her chest. It was over. The truth had won. And Vernon Dale, who had spent his whole life building a reputation on lies and cruelty, had finally been exposed for what he truly was. Judge Whitmore turned to Jonah. "Mr. Creed, stand up." Jonah stood, his face carefully neutral, and Lila held her breath. "Based on the testimony I've heard today," the judge said, "I find that you acted in self-defense when confronted by armed intruders on your property. The deaths of Willis and Garrett, while tragic, were the result of their own actions and Vernon Dale's deceptions. No charges will be filed against you. You're free to go." Lila felt tears of relief streaming down her face. Jonah turned to her, his own eyes suspiciously bright, and they embraced there in the courtroom while the crowd erupted in applause. Samuel, startled by the noise, began to cry, and Lila and Jonah both laughed through their tears as they tried to soothe him. Sheriff Morrison came over, a rare smile on his weathered face. "Congratulations," he said. "Justice doesn't always win, but today it did." "Thank you, Sheriff," Jonah said, shaking his hand, "for believing us, for investigating thoroughly. You're a good man." "Just doing my job," Morrison said, but he looked pleased. "Now get out of here. I believe you have a wedding to attend." They did. Reverend Walsh, his face still marked with shame but his voice steady, married them that evening in the small church where Lila had been baptized as a baby. Mrs. Chen and Sheriff Morrison stood as witnesses. Mr. Schneider and his wife came too, and Mrs. Patterson with tears streaming down her face. Tom Brewster stood at the back, his hat in his hands. Even Thompson showed up, wanting to see the end of the story he'd been part of. Lila wore her best dress and the wooden ring Jonah had carved, and she carried wildflowers that Mrs. Chen had gathered from her garden. Jonah wore his cleanest clothes and had shaved carefully, and he looked at Lila like she was the most precious thing in the world. Samuel, held by Mrs. Chen during the ceremony, cooed and gurgled as if adding his own blessing. "Do you, Jonah Creed, take Lila Dale to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Walsh asked, his voice carrying through the small church. "I do," Jonah said firmly. "I did from the moment I agreed to bring her home with me, and I do now, and I will every day for the rest of my life." "And do you, Lila Dale, take Jonah Creed to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Lila said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "He saved my life and gave me a home and loved me when I thought I was unlovable. I'll be proud to be his wife until my last breath. Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife." Reverend Walsh's smile was genuine despite the guilt still lingering in his eyes. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Creed." Jonah kissed her gently, sweetly, and the small crowd in the church applauded. When they broke apart, both smiling, Lila felt like her heart might burst with happiness. She was married. She had a husband who loved her, a son who was healthy and strong, and a home waiting for her in the mountains. Vernon Dale had tried to destroy her, but instead he'd inadvertently given her everything she'd ever wanted. They spent one more night at the boarding house, and the next morning they prepared to leave. Before they could depart, though, Mrs. Patterson approached the wagon, her hands twisted nervously in her apron. "Mrs. Creed," she said hesitantly, "might I have a word?" Lila climbed down from the wagon, Samuel on her hip. "Of course, Mrs. Patterson." The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to apologize for not speaking up that day, for staying silent all winter while Vernon told his lies. I was a coward, and you suffered for it. You spoke up when it mattered," Lila said quietly. "At the hearing, that took courage. Not enough courage, and not soon enough." Mrs. Patterson reached out and gently touched Samuel's cheek. "He's beautiful. You're blessed, Mrs. Creed, truly blessed. And that man of yours, he's a good one. Hold on to him." "I intend to," Lila said, and found she could smile at the woman despite everything. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson, for the apology and for the kind words." Similar scenes played out as they prepared to leave. Mr. Schneider gave them supplies for the journey, refusing payment. Tom Brewster had shoed their horses and repaired their wagon, also refusing payment. Even strangers stopped to wish them well, to say they were glad the truth had come out, to apologize for their own silence and complicity. As they drove out of Dry Creek, Lila looked back one last time at the town that had been her prison. She felt no sadness, no longing to return. That part of her life was over, finished, as dead as her father's reputation. Ahead lay the mountains and home, and that was all that mattered. The journey back seemed shorter somehow, lighter. They stopped at the same stream for lunch, and Jonah spread out a blanket so they could rest properly. Samuel played on the blanket, grabbing at grass and trying to eat it, while Lila and Jonah sat close together. "How do you feel?" Jonah asked. "Now that it's all over?" "Free," Lila said after a moment's thought. "For the first time in my life, I feel completely free. Vernon has no power over me anymore. The town knows the truth, and I'm married to you, really and properly married, and no one can question it." "Mrs. Creed," Jonah said, testing the name. "I like the sound of that." "So do I." Lila leaned against him, comfortable and content. "Thank you, Jonah, for everything. For saving me, for loving me, for giving me a life worth living." "You saved me too," Jonah reminded her. "Saved me from a life of lonely grief, from believing I didn't deserve happiness. We saved each other, Lila. That's what makes it real." They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Bess lowed a greeting from the barn, and the chickens clucked excitedly at their return. The cabin looked small and weathered, but perfect, and when Jonah helped Lila down from the wagon, she felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. Not the house she'd grown up in with Vernon's cold presence filling every corner, but this small cabin in the high country where she'd learned what love really meant. That night, after they'd unpacked and fed the animals and eaten a simple supper, Lila sat in the rocking chair Jonah had made while she was pregnant, nursing Samuel and watching Jonah stoke the fire. The domesticity of it, the simple rightness, made her throat tighten with emotion. "What are you thinking about?" Jonah asked, catching her watching him. "About how far we've come," Lila said. About the girl I was last fall, scared and pregnant and convinced she was worthless. About how that girl would never have believed she could be this happy. You were never worthless, Jonah said firmly, coming to kneel beside her chair. You were always strong, always brave. You just needed someone to see it. And you did, Lila whispered. You saw it when no one else would. Jonah reached up and cupped her face gently. I see you, Lila Creed. I see your strength and your courage and your enormous heart. I see the amazing mother you are, the incredible woman you've become. And I'm honored that you chose me. They kissed softly while Samuel nursed, oblivious to his parents' emotion. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. The weeks that followed fell into the rhythm of their life before, but sweeter somehow, richer. Spring turned the mountains into a paradise of green and gold, and Jonah planted the garden with Lila's help. Samuel grew and changed daily, becoming more alert and interactive, reaching for his parents with chubby hands and laughing at the carved toys Jonah made for him. And every morning, Lila woke beside her husband and felt grateful for the life she'd been given. One afternoon in late May, Lila was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard horses approaching. Her first instinct was fear, memories of Vernon's attack still fresh, but then she recognized Sheriff Morrison's voice calling out a greeting. "Just me," Morrison said as Jonah came around from the woodpile, rifle in hand, "and I come bearing news." They invited him in for coffee, and Morrison settled at the table with Samuel on his knee. The baby grabbed at the sheriff's star, fascinated by its shine, and Morrison gently extracted his tiny fingers and gave him a carved wooden star instead, Jonah's work, Lila recognized. "Vernon's been sent to territorial prison," Morrison said without preamble. "Judge Whitmore didn't let him delay or negotiate his way out. He's serving his full 6 months, and when he gets out, his property will be sold to pay his fines and restitution. Man's going to come out with nothing. No money, no reputation, no friends. Everything he built his life on, gone." "Good," Lila said with no sympathy in her voice. "Maybe he'll learn something from it." "Maybe," Morrison said doubtfully, "though men like Vernon Dale rarely do. But I thought you'd want to know. He can't hurt you anymore. He has no power, no influence, nothing. You're safe." "We were always safe," Jonah said quietly. "Up here together, but thank you for letting us know." Morrison left after finishing his coffee, riding back down the mountain with a wave. Lila stood on the porch and watched him go, and felt another weight lift from her shoulders. Vernon was truly gone now, his power broken, his lies exposed. The man who had tried to destroy her had destroyed himself instead, and there was a poetry in that she couldn't help but appreciate. Summer came to the high country in a riot of wildflowers and warm breezes. Samuel learned to sit up on his own, then to crawl, then to pull himself up on furniture and stand on wobbly legs. Lila and Jonah worked side by side in the garden, taught Samuel to pet Bess gently, spent long evenings on the porch watching the sun paint the peaks in impossible colors. One evening in August, as they sat watching the stars come out, Jonah said, "Sarah would have liked you." It was the first time he'd mentioned his first wife since the wedding, and Lila turned to him with surprise. "You think so?" "I know so. She had a big heart, and she would have seen what I see, a strong, brave woman who survived hell and came out stronger. She would have loved how you are with Samuel, how you've made this cabin into a real home." Jonah paused, then added quietly, "I'll always love her memory, but I love you, Lila. You're my present and my future, and I'm grateful for every day I get to spend with you." "I love you too," Lila said, reaching for his hand. "And I'm glad you had Sarah, glad you knew that kind of love before. It made you the man you are, the man who could see past what everyone else saw and recognize something worth saving." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, while Samuel slept peacefully inside and the night deepened around them. And Lila thought about the journey that had brought her here, about being sold by her father, about walking up this mountain convinced she was going to die, about learning that punishment could become salvation and that the cruelest sentence could lead to the greatest blessing. Vernon Dale had meant to destroy her. He'd sold her to a stranger, sent her away to die, erased her from his life like she'd never existed. But instead of ending her story, he'd inadvertently begun it. He'd sent her to a man who would love her, to a place that would become home, to a life that was more fulfilling than anything she could have imagined in Dry Creek. She was no longer Lila Dale, the disgraced daughter who had shamed her family. She was Lila Creed, wife, mother, survivor. She had a husband who looked at her like she hung the moon, a son who filled her days with joy, and a home in the mountains that felt like paradise compared to the prison her father's house had been. As autumn painted the aspen gold and the first cold winds began to blow down from the peaks, Lila stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked out at her kingdom. The garden had yielded well, and they had food stored for winter. The firewood was stacked high against the wall. Samuel was healthy and happy, babbling in his own private language and learning new things every day. And Jonah was chopping wood in the yard, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his face peaceful in a way it had never been when she'd first met him. This was her life now. Not the life she'd been born into, not the life she'd imagined with Billy Henderson, but something better, something real and earned and chosen. She'd been sold, but she'd found her worth. She'd been sent away to die, but she'd chosen to live. And in living, in surviving, in refusing to let Vernon's cruelty define her, she'd found everything she'd ever needed. Jonah looked up from his work and saw her watching. He smiled, that full, genuine smile that transformed his scarred face into something beautiful, and she smiled back. Then Samuel crawled to the doorway, pulling himself up on her skirt, and she scooped him up and carried him out into the warm autumn sunshine. Together, the three of them stood in front of the cabin that had become their sanctuary. Behind them, the mountains rose like guardian walls. Below them, somewhere far away, Dry Creek went about its business, probably still gossiping about Vernon Dale's fall and Lila Creed's survival. But up here, none of that mattered. Up here, they were safe and loved and home. And as Jonah came to stand beside her, as he wrapped his arm around her waist and pressed a kiss to her temple, as Samuel laughed and reached for a butterfly drifting past on golden wings, Lila knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The story that had begun with a father's cruel punishment had ended with a daughter's hard-won happiness. The sail that was supposed to destroy her had saved her instead, and the mountain that was supposed to be her grave had become her garden, her refuge, her forever home. She was Lila Creed, and she was free. And that was how the story ended, not with tragedy, but with triumph. Not with shame, but with love. Not with an ending at all, really, but with a beginning. A beginning that would last the rest of her life, lived in the mountains with the man who saw her worth and the child who was her future, far from the poison lies of Vernon Dale and the judgment of Dry Creek. She had been sold, but she had found herself. And in the end, that made all the difference.